My name is Maxwell. I am 69 years old and I spent my entire life building a fortune from the intense, suffocating heat of an Ohio steel mill so my family would never have to know the bitter sting of poverty. As a highly successful real estate investor, I gave them absolutely everything they ever asked for. Last Tuesday, they showed me exactly what my lifetime of sacrifice meant to them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who dangerously underestimated your worth. I stood in the center of my master bedroom folding a white linen shirt. I had fully funded a luxurious 2-week Mediterranean cruise for my son Jordan, his wife Heather, and her parents. My phone vibrated aggressively against the polished mahogany surface of my bedroom dresser. I picked the device up and opened a new message from Jordan. The text was incredibly brief and blatantly cowardly. He claimed a random ticketing error had occurred with the cruise line and my premium cabin was no longer available. He quickly added the real, undisguised reason in the very next line of the text. Heather wanted an exclusive, intimate trip with her parents, and my presence would disrupt their family bonding experience. I did not call him to argue about the disrespect. I did not scream or throw the phone against the wall. I simply folded the linen shirt, placed it back into my wooden drawer, and calmly zipped my empty canvas suitcase closed. I reached down and touched the heavy gold watch resting firmly on my left wrist. My late wife Evelyn bought me this expensive timepiece after my 20th consecutive year working the blast furnaces at the steel mill. We inhaled toxic coal dust and worked double shifts for decades to build our extensive real estate portfolio from the ground up. We swore our son would never have to beg for a seat at any table in his life. He repaid that massive sacrifice by treating me like a disposable second-class servant. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and opened my laptop. I logged into my secure offshore banking portal to officially cancel my personal boarding pass for the ship. I navigated to the shared family expense ledger to review the final trip charges before logging out. A glaring red notification pulsed violently in the upper right corner of the bright monitor screen. A $15,000 unauthorized charge sat pending on my primary corporate credit line. I clicked on the detailed invoice to examine the fraudulent transaction carefully. It was specifically flagged for a luxury penthouse suite upgrade on the exact same cruise ship I was just banned from boarding. The primary passenger name legally assigned to the opulent suite was Gregory. Gregory is Heather's father. Jordan deliberately used my own money to purchase a massive first-class upgrade for the very man who just ousted me from the family vacation. My son was not just a spineless coward who bowed constantly to his wife's deep-seated prejudices. He was an active, calculating thief, stealing directly from the man who fed him. I opened the digital authorization form attached to the electronic invoice. I stared intensely at the electronic signature rendering at the bottom of the white page. The digital letters matched my handwriting perfectly. When Jordan was 10 years old, he struggled immensely with a strict math teacher and received a failing grade. He was absolutely terrified of Evelyn finding out about his failure. I sat him down at the kitchen table and taught him exactly how to trace my signature to sign his own report cards. I told him a man must know how to carefully navigate systems that are designed to fail him. I meant it as a vital lesson in survival for a young black boy growing up in a harsh, unforgiving world. He took that sacred lesson, twisted it completely, and weaponized it to rob his own father blind almost 30 years later. He utilized my survival tactic to finance the staggering vanity of a white man who openly despised my existence. I did not close the laptop in a fit of rage. I immediately executed a total irreversible freeze on that specific credit line, securely locking the account from any further financial transactions. I stood up from my desk with a strange, icy calm washing completely over my chest. I walked down the long hallway and grabbed my car keys from the brass hook mounted by the front door. I stepped out into my darkened, silent garage and slid into the driver's seat of my heavy sedan. I turned the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life in the quiet, enclosed space. Their international flight to Miami was scheduled to depart early the next morning. I needed to see them with my own eyes before they left for the airport. I put the heavy car in reverse and backed out into the cold, unforgiving night. I drove across town toward the upscale suburban neighborhood where Jordan and Heather lived. The paved streets grew noticeably wider and the properties grew significantly larger as I entered the wealthy enclave of sprawling colonial homes. Jordan proudly walked around this pristine neighborhood believing he was the absolute master of his suburban castle. He did not know that I completely owned the house through a private corporate LLC. I leased the massive structure to him for absolute pennies to ensure he could confidently maintain his grand illusion of success among his elite judgmental peers. I parked my heavy sedan 2 blocks away, hiding the vehicle deep in the dense shadows of the flickering street lamps. I stepped out into the humid night air and walked silently toward the property. I did not want them to hear the deep rumble of my engine pulling into their quiet, secluded cul-de-sac. I approached the front of the house and noticed a jagged crack forming in the driveway asphalt near the brick mailbox. I vividly remembered the sweltering, exhaustive afternoon I stood on that exact spot paying the local contractors in raw cash to pour that concrete 5 years ago. I built their perfect suburban illusion from the dirt up. I provided the pristine foundation they currently stood upon to look down at me with such profound arrogance. I walked straight past the cracked driveway and slowly approached the tall wooden side gate leading to the expansive backyard. I heard loud, booming laughter echoing sharply from the rear stone patio. I pushed the heavy gate open without making a single sound. I stepped carefully onto the soft grass and moved directly into the deep, impenetrable shadow of the massive oak tree I had personally planted when they first moved in. I stood completely still in the absolute darkness, rendering myself completely invisible to the people celebrating under the bright, warm patio lights. I looked directly toward the expensive outdoor seating area that I had fully financed. Gregory stood proudly at the head of the long teakwood table. He wore a crisp linen shirt and a triumphant, deeply arrogant smile that made my blood run entirely cold within my veins as I watched from the hidden tree line. I watched closely as he uncorked a bottle of premium scotch and began pouring the dark amber liquid into thick crystal glasses. He handed a full glass to his daughter Heather and then raised his own glass toward the night sky in a victorious, mocking toast to a highly successful theft. I remained perfectly still in the absolute darkness of the yard, letting the humid night air completely conceal my physical presence. The warm, artificial glow of the patio heaters illuminated the scene like a theatrical stage specifically designed for my own humiliation. Gregory casually swirled his expensive scotch in the heavy crystal glass I had personally purchased for my son's 3rd wedding anniversary. He took a slow, deliberate sip and loudly mocked the architectural design of the surrounding houses, calling the entire neighborhood a tasteless, uninspired collection of overpriced suburban starter kits. Heather threw her head back and laughed, the shrill sound cutting sharply through the quiet serenity of the cul-de-sac. She clinked her wineglass against her father's glass in a celebratory toast to their upcoming voyage. She bragged openly to Gregory that Jordan had finally developed a functional spine and forced the stubborn old man off the cruise passenger manifest. Gregory chuckled, smoothing the fine sleeves of his pristine cashmere sweater with an air of complete superiority. He came from isolated generational country club wealth, a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a golf club in his entire 60 years on Earth. From the very first day Jordan introduced Heather to our family, Gregory had viewed my blue-collar African-American heritage as a permanent, unfortunate stain on his daughter's pristine social status. He tolerated my existence only when it provided a convenient financial subsidy for his lavish lifestyle. I stood silently in the deep protective shadow of the oak tree and listened to them tear my dignity apart piece by piece. Heather told her father that my constant presence was an absolute embarrassment to their carefully curated public image. She firmly stated they could not possibly enjoy a luxury Mediterranean vacation with a man who still checked the price of the wine menu before ordering a drink. Gregory nodded in absolute agreement, stating that some people simply belonged in the background of modern society. The heavy glass sliding door suddenly scraped open, interrupting their hateful, arrogant laughter. Jordan stepped out onto the patio, holding a polished wooden humidor. He walked directly toward his father-in-law with an eager, subservient posture that made my stomach turn in absolute disgust. He opened the wooden box and offered Gregory a premium cigar. Jordan produced a heavy silver lighter and dutifully lit Gregory's premium cigar. Gregory exhaled a thick, aromatic plume of gray smoke into the night air and patted my son firmly on the shoulder. He commended Jordan for finally cutting me loose from the exclusive family vacation. Gregory stated with absolute conviction that my presence would have completely ruined the sophisticated aesthetic of their first-class dining experience on the ship. He said the other wealthy passengers would have instinctively assumed I was part of the hired help serving the tables. I stood motionless in the shadows and waited for my son to defend my honor. I waited for Jordan to demand basic human respect for the father who had financed his entire comfortable existence. Instead, Jordan nodded eagerly like an obedient subordinate. He agreed with his father-in-law without a single second of hesitation or regret. Jordan added that my endless stories about the brutal shifts at the steel mill were thoroughly exhausting and entirely inappropriate for high society gatherings. He claimed I lacked the social refinement necessary to navigate an exclusive European cruise. I gripped the rough, uneven bark of the oak tree to steady myself against the crushing weight of his words. The physical pain in my calloused hands was absolutely nothing compared to the sharp, suffocating betrayal piercing my chest. I had built the very cedar deck they were currently standing on. I measured, cut, and hammered every single wooden board with my own 2 hands so my future grandchildren would have a beautiful, safe place to play in the summer sun. Jordan was literally standing on my sweat and grueling labor while openly mocking my history to appease a man who fundamentally despised him. Heather stepped closer to her husband and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. She loudly mentioned the $15,000 penthouse suite upgrade on the luxury ship. She kissed Jordan passionately on the cheek, praising his incredible financial success and his unique ability to provide her parents with the ultimate luxury experience. Jordan smiled broadly, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. He accepted the praise and the credit for the stolen money without a flinch of moral guilt. He looked his wife directly in the eyes and promised her the vacation of a lifetime completely free from the heavy burden of his father's presence. I did not burst out onto the illuminated patio to interrupt their arrogant celebration. I did not storm across the manicured grass to demand my stolen money back or scream about the profound disrespect they had just shown me. Confrontation is the desperate, noisy weapon of the powerless and the weak. Silence is the precise, devastating tool of the executioner. I had seen enough and heard enough to permanently cure me of any lingering paternal guilt I might have harbored deep in my heart. I stepped backward into the deeper darkness of the yard, carefully avoiding the dry, brittle leaves scattered across the manicured grass. I navigated the perimeter of the property like a phantom, slipping out through the heavy wooden side gate and pulling the latch shut without a single metallic click. I walked down the quiet suburban sidewalk back toward my parked car in absolute calculated silence. Evelyn's raspy voice echoed vividly in my memory with every measured step I took away from the house. She had warned me on her deathbed, her breathing shallow and her grip weak, that Jordan's desperate, pathetic need for white validation would eventually consume his loyalty to his own blood. She told me his relentless desire to belong to Heather's privileged world would make him entirely blind to our decades of grueling sacrifices. She was completely tragically right. I unlocked my heavy sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. I started the engine, letting the dashboard illuminate the dark interior of the cabin. I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket and opened the airline application. I checked the international flight departure schedules for their specific booked itinerary. They were scheduled to fly out to the Miami port at the absolute crack of dawn. I put the heavy car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the pristine neighborhood and my treacherous son behind me in the rearview mirror. I did not drive home to rest or sleep. I drove through the empty, winding city streets as my mind formulated a meticulous, unforgiving plan of action. I needed to look my son in the eyes one last time before I burned his stolen kingdom to the ground. I decided I needed to intercept them directly at the busy international airport terminal before their flight. I stood near the polished chrome of the first-class check-in counter at the international airport. Dawn broke through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the sterile terrazzo floor. The terminal buzzed with the low hum of early morning travelers. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight despite my 69 years. The automatic sliding doors parted with a mechanical hiss. Jordan, Heather, and Gregory walked into the terminal carrying matching monogrammed designer luggage. They moved with the unearned, entitled confidence of absolute royalty. Gregory walked slightly ahead, holding his chin high, while my son trailed behind them like an obedient servant managing the heavy bags. Jordan glanced toward the premium service kiosk to check their flight status. He saw me standing by the stanchions. He froze completely in his tracks. The blood drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. 30 years ago, I carried a young Jordan on my shoulders through this exact terminal. I had worked a grueling 80-hour week at the steel mill just to afford the gas to drive here and buy him a wooden toy airplane from the gift shop. We stood by the thick glass watching the commercial jets take off into the clouds, and I promised him he would fly on them one day. I kept that sacred promise. Now he stared at me not as a devoted father, but as a persistent bill collector threatening to repossess his carefully curated illusion. He dropped his heavy leather duffel bag onto the floor. He rushed forward deliberately, placing his physical body between me and his wife's family. He grabbed my forearm, his grip sweaty and incredibly desperate. He spoke in a frantic, hurried whisper, immediately regurgitating the exact lie he had texted me the day before. He claimed the luxury cruise line had severely overbooked the premium cabins, and a systemic ticketing error randomly erased my reservation. He practically begged me not to make a public scene and disrupt Heather's fragile nerves before the long transatlantic flight. I looked at his panicked eyes. He was terrified his father-in-law would discover the truth about my wealth and his own absolute financial incompetence. I maintained my composure. I played the exact role my son desperately needed me to play. I adopted the persona of the docile, highly understanding, and slightly confused elderly father. I smiled warmly and patted Jordan gently on his trembling shoulder. I told him in a loud, comforting voice that I completely understood how these massive corporate errors happen, and assured him I held no anger regarding the sudden cancellation. Heather stepped forward, clicking her designer heels against the polished floor. She offered a remarkably condescending, deeply fake apology about the unfortunate mix-up. She tilted her head, feigning sympathy, and stated it was a shame I would miss the beautiful Mediterranean weather. I thanked her for her concern. I then turned my attention to her father. I extended my right hand toward Gregory in a traditional gesture of goodwill. Gregory stopped walking. He stared down at my dark, heavily calloused hand. Those calluses were forged by decades of gripping molten steel tongs to ensure his son-in-law could afford the bespoke suit currently draped over his shoulders. Gregory did not lift his arm. He refused to shake my hand entirely, claiming a sudden, severe fear of airport germs. He adjusted his cashmere sweater, turned his back to me without uttering a single word, and instructed the ticketing agent to process their luggage. Jordan let out a massive, visible sigh of profound relief, firmly believing he had successfully managed the morning crisis. He believed his web of deceit remained perfectly intact. The airline agent informed Jordan of a substantial overweight baggage fee for Heather's 4 massive suitcases. Jordan did not reach for his own debit card. He confidently pulled a sleek metal credit card from his leather wallet and handed it directly to the ticketing agent. It was my stolen corporate card. He handed the agent the plastic instrument of his own theft right in front of my face, completely assured that I had no idea about the unauthorized $15,000 charge. I watched the magnetic stripe slide through the reader. The sheer audacity of his action solidified my absolute resolve. He felt entitled to my life's work while simultaneously erasing my existence from his life. The agent took the card and swiped it through the electronic terminal. The electronic terminal beeped approvingly, printing a long white receipt. The transaction cleared immediately because I had purposefully unfroze that specific credit line sitting in my car exactly 10 minutes prior. I needed Jordan to feel completely invincible as he stepped onto that airplane. I needed him to fly across the ocean wrapped in a blinding, comfortable blanket of absolute financial security. I smiled brightly and wished them all a spectacular, unforgettable voyage. Jordan thanked me hastily, grabbed his heavy duffel bag, and quickly ushered his wife and father-in-law away from the counter. I stood by the ticketing kiosk and watched them walk toward the priority security checkpoint. Heather linked her arm through Jordan's, laughing loudly at a joke Gregory made. They moved as a united, exclusive front. I waited in the busy terminal until they finally disappeared down the long, descending escalator toward their departure gate. The final remnants of the deep paternal instinct inside me officially died in that precise moment. There was absolutely no son left to protect or guide. There was only a ruthless, calculating thief left to aggressively prosecute. I turned away from the security gates and walked back toward the sliding exit doors. The morning sun was fully up, casting bright, harsh light across the airport drop-off lanes. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure smartphone. I scrolled past Jordan's newly blocked contact profile and dialed the direct encrypted line of my corporate attorney, Mr. Gallagher. I did not need to check the time. Gallagher was always at his mahogany desk by 6 in the morning. He answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. I did not offer a greeting. I did not provide an emotional summary of the betrayal I had just witnessed. I gave him a concise, 2-word directive that would systematically dismantle my son's entire fraudulent existence. Initiate Protocol 0. The phone line remained silent for a fraction of a second before Gallagher firmly acknowledged the absolute command. He knew exactly what those words meant for the future of my estate. I ended the call and stepped out into the humid morning air. The game of quiet submission was permanently over. I sat back deep into the incredibly comfortable polished black leather chair positioned inside Mr. Gallagher's expansive mahogany-paneled high-rise office. The sprawling city skyline stretched out brightly behind him, but my attention remained entirely fixed on the heavy glass table between us. We spread the complete, unredacted records of Jordan's financial footprint across the transparent surface. The absolute staggering breadth of his selfish parasitic existence was completely laid bare in stark black and white ink. Gallagher stood up and walked over to the heavy steel door of his fireproof wall vault. He spun the mechanical dial, pulled the heavy metal lever, and extracted a single crisp manila envelope. He walked back to the table and laid the authentic deed to Jordan's colonial house squarely in front of me. 2 years ago, Heather had aggressively demanded that Jordan produce a physical deed to the suburban property. She needed tangible proof of his masculinity and utter financial independence to display to her wealthy country club friends. I chose the path of least resistance at the time to maintain the fragile family peace. I instructed Gallagher to draft a highly official-looking but legally hollow ceremonial piece of paper to temporarily appease her ravenous ego. I allowed them to frame that worthless certificate and hang it proudly in their sterile hallway. The true notarized municipal deed always remained firmly registered to my irrevocable blind trust, locking them completely out of any actual equity or leverage. I touched the raised municipal seal on the authentic document resting on the glass table. I suddenly felt a very grim, powerful sense of deep validation, knowing I had never fully surrendered the heavy keys to my hard-earned kingdom. Gallagher did not return my grim smile. His expression remained carved from solid stone as he reached back into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a new, highly classified banking document printed on thick security paper. He slid the document deliberately across the smooth glass. The paper came to rest directly over the authentic deed. Gallagher leaned forward, resting his elbows firmly on the table. He took his heavy silver fountain pen and tapped the metal tip sharply against a heavily bolded paragraph near the bottom of the page. The incredibly sharp, distinct metallic clicking sound echoed loudly inside the extremely quiet, heavily insulated office, instantly demanding my absolute attention before I could read a single terrifying word. I slowly picked up the classified banking document from the table and carefully adjusted my reading glasses. I read the bolded paragraph twice to ensure I fully comprehended the absolute audacity of the crime. Jordan did not simply steal $15,000 for a meaningless cruise suite upgrade. He utilized that fake ceremonial deed to actively defraud a major financial institution. He applied for a massive, unapproved cash-out equity loan against the suburban colonial house. The formally stated purpose of the withdrawal was to entirely fund Heather's upcoming vanity cosmetics business. He illegally leveraged a property he did not own to quickly finance his wife's delusional entrepreneurial fantasies. I stared intensely at the forged signatures lining the margins of the loan application. I navigated the brutal, systemic redlining of the 1980s real estate market to build a completely pristine credit score. I fought tooth and nail against a banking system historically designed to keep a black man permanently locked out of commercial wealth. I established a flawless corporate umbrella through decades of relentless, unyielding discipline. Jordan casually and recklessly used my incredibly spotless protected legacy as a highly convenient battering ram to instantly secure a massive, fraudulent $250,000 loan. He intentionally committed textbook federal wire fraud directly under my deeply protected corporate name. I placed the paper back onto the glass table, feeling a cold knot of fury tightening in my gut. Gallagher clasped his large hands tightly together. He informed me with absolute clinical precision that the bank had already approved the preliminary underwriting for the massive transaction. The incredibly flawed automated verification system fully accepted the forged legal documents without triggering any immediate manual human review. The $250,000 would clear directly into Jordan's personal checking account by next Friday morning. The exact, precise second those highly illegal stolen funds processed immense and totally devastating legal liability would permanently transfer directly onto my aged shoulders. I would be held legally responsible for a fraudulent $250,000 mortgage on a property housed inside my own irrevocable trust. Jordan had effectively strapped a ticking financial time bomb to my chest while he sailed across the Mediterranean Sea drinking expensive champagne. I silently looked up at the ticking clock mounted firmly on Gallagher's office wall. We had less than 7 days to completely disarm the explosive before it detonated my entire legacy. I dropped the heavy banking document onto the polished mahogany desk with a sharp thud. The severity of the situation required immediate, unapologetic action. I leaned forward and asked Gallagher exactly how to legally amputate the catastrophic liability before the fraudulent funds could clear the institutional escrow. I absolutely and firmly refused to let my foolish son drag my hard-earned empire into a massive, highly public federal indictment. Gallagher adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and explained the brutal mechanics of the necessary countermeasure. We had to completely liquidate the physical collateral associated with the loan application. If I legally sold the land out from under the pending mortgage, the abrupt transfer of the property title would instantly trigger a catastrophic automated banking alert. The institutional underwriters would scramble to verify the asset, immediately halting the transfer of the $250,000 and officially exposing Jordan's forged paperwork to the federal fraud department. It was an incredibly severe, irreversible maneuver. It meant completely erasing the house my son called his permanent home. My late wife Evelyn always told me to act exactly like a specialized surgeon when cutting out malignant cancer from our lives. She warned me that emotional hesitation only breeds deeper infection. The surgeon must be swift, remarkably precise, and act without a single ounce of hesitation to save the healthy tissue. Jordan had become a financial malignancy, actively threatening the survival of everything we had painstakingly built over 4 decades. The lingering emotional attachment to the colonial house vanished from my heart, replaced entirely by cold, calculated survival instinct. I nodded once, granting Gallagher the absolute authorization to proceed with the legal execution. Gallagher opened the brass latch of his briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored business card. He slid the heavy card across the smooth glass table. He explained that the card belonged to a notoriously ruthless commercial real estate developer. This specific developer had aggressively desired the exact suburban land under Jordan's house for over a decade. The developer wanted to bulldoze the entire residential block to construct a highly profitable retail plaza, and my corner lot was the critical missing piece of his corporate monopoly. I picked up the cream-colored card and studied the embossed gold lettering. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I dialed the developer's direct line. I stepped out of the elevator and into the sterile glass-walled conference room of Apex Retail Development. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, chilling the minimalist corporate space. A man in a sharp slate-gray suit sat at the head of a massive frosted glass table. He did not stand when I entered. He gestured casually to the empty chair across from him. He assumed I was a desperate, aging African-American man seeking a quick payout. He tossed a glossy folder onto the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He immediately launched into a very rapid, aggressive pitch, throwing out a ridiculous lowball offer that was less than half the actual market value of the colonial house. He cited outdated market trends and fabricated neighborhood depreciation. He attempted to overwhelm me with corporate jargon, entirely confident that my blue-collar roots rendered me incapable of understanding complex commercial real estate maneuvers. I did not interrupt his rehearsed monologue. I sat back in the ergonomic leather chair and let him finish his patronizing performance. When he finally stopped talking and offered a smug, victorious smile, I leaned forward and placed my hands flat on the glass surface. I looked him directly in the eye and dismantled his entire argument piece by piece. I spent 20 grueling years attending late-night city council meetings, fighting predatory developers exactly like him to fiercely protect my growing investments. I did not just read the law, I memorized it. I recited the precise municipal zoning codes and recent district boundary revisions word for word. I detailed exactly how the specific geographic coordinates of my residential lot served as the absolute legal linchpin for his proposed multi-million-dollar retail plaza. Without owning my specific highly coveted parcel of land, his ambitious project was completely dead in the water due to mandatory commercial access regulations. The color drained from his face in an instant. His smug, arrogant smile vanished entirely, replaced by the grim realization that he had dangerously underestimated his opponent. He realized he could not simply cheat me out of my hard-earned property. He reached into his designer briefcase, pulled out a completely different, heavily revised contract, and slid it across the glass table. He abandoned his initial insulting lowball tactic entirely. He then leaned forward across the expansive table and instead offered me exactly double the current local market value in pure, immediate, and completely unencumbered cash. I stared down at the heavily revised contract resting on the table. I did not pick up the document. I looked back up at the developer and flatly rejected his generous second offer. I demanded a full 20% premium layered directly on top of his absolute highest bid. The developer clenched his jaw tightly. He cursed quietly under his breath, his professional facade severely cracking under the immense pressure of the negotiation. He knew he possessed absolutely zero leverage in this specific room. He quickly calculated the catastrophic potential loss of his entire commercial enterprise against my remarkably steep demand. He reluctantly agreed to pay the massive premium without any further argument. However, he immediately established one absolute, strictly non-negotiable condition for the rapid transaction. He leaned forward and pointed a rigid finger at the paperwork. He stated the entire residential property must be completely vacant, fully stripped of all local utilities, and entirely ready for immediate demolition by Friday morning. If a single piece of personal furniture, a stray moving box, or a lingering tenant remained inside the structure, at dawn the entire lucrative deal was permanently voided. I thought about the house. Jordan absolutely loved the pristine, highly manicured landscaping of his sprawling suburban yard. He paid an expensive professional crew weekly in cash just to maintain the vibrant green illusion of his immense personal success to his wealthy neighbors. He cared far more about the superficial visual aesthetics of the exterior than the actual structural integrity of his marriage or his familial loyalty. I knew wiping that perfect lawn completely off the map would utterly devastate him. I looked at the developer's stern, uncompromising face. He repeated his harsh deadline aggressively, emphasizing that his bulldozers operated on a very strict corporate schedule. He needed the physical land scraped entirely clean down to the foundational bedrock to begin laying his commercial foundation immediately. He asked me directly if I could legally guarantee a completely empty, abandoned structure in less than 4 days. He stared at me, searching my expression for any sign of weakness. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding corporate resolve. I assured him the house would be legally eradicated before the sun rose on Friday morning. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of emotional hesitation. I told him very firmly that I would definitely deliver the dirt perfectly bare. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. Evelyn had purchased the expensive pen to commemorate the absolute final payment on our very first commercial property. I twisted the textured cap off and laid the heavy document flat against the table. I read the strict demolition clause twice to ensure there were absolutely zero hidden legal loopholes. The severe corporate language explicitly mandated the total structural annihilation of the colonial home. I pressed the sharp gold nib directly against the dotted line. I signed my full legal name with completely steady, unwavering hands, legally condemning my son's pristine suburban castle to the ruthless steel wrecking ball. I lifted the pen and examined the dark, wet signature gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I handed the gold pen and the fully executed contract back to the eager developer. The wet ink on the thick paper was solid black, but it profoundly represented the absolute permanent end of my bloodline's unearned inheritance. The devastating financial umbilical cord was officially severed forever. The developer inspected my signature meticulously. He smiled a wide, predatory grin that exposed his teeth. He extended his right hand toward me across the wide glass table. I firmly shook his hand. He confidently promised that his massive yellow bulldozers would be idling aggressively on the suburban street precisely at dawn on Friday morning. I gathered my briefcase, nodded briefly, and walked straight out of the glass-walled conference room. I did not look back. I strode purposefully down the quiet corridor and stepped directly into the waiting elevator. The steel doors slid shut, sealing the fate of Jordan's perfect illusion. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket the exact second the elevator began its rapid descent. I opened my private contacts directory and immediately dialed the direct, unlisted number of an elite high-speed eviction crew. The operation required ruthless efficiency. I needed a specialized team capable of completely stripping a large residential property down to the bare drywall in under 48 hours. The gruff foreman answered the phone on the second ring. I provided the exact suburban address and authorized a massive cash bonus for extreme speed. I ordered him to dispatch his largest trucks immediately. The countdown to Jordan's total erasure had officially begun. I instructed the capable foreman to completely pack the pristine house away. Forever. A convoy of 3 massive unmarked moving trucks pulled up to the curb of the quiet suburban street, their heavy diesel engines idling with a deep, rhythmic rumble. I stepped out of my heavy sedan and walked directly up the paved walkway toward Jordan's colonial house. The morning dew still clung to the perfectly manicured lawn. I stepped onto the expansive front porch and reached into my coat pocket. I slid my heavy brass master key directly into the polished deadbolt. The lock clicked open with a sharp, satisfying snap. I pushed the heavy oak door wide open, revealing the silent, cavernous interior of the living room. The sheer emptiness of the space struck me immediately. Heather had painstakingly decorated the entire house in an incredibly sterile, lifeless palette of stark whites and pale grays. She deliberately stripped the home of any genuine warmth or familial history. 2 years ago, she explicitly banned all photographs of me and Evelyn from the primary living spaces. She haughtily claimed that our vintage wooden picture frames severely disrupted her pristine modern aesthetic. In reality, she simply wanted to erase the undeniable visual evidence of the black blue-collar laborers who actually financed the expensive roof over her head. The spotless walls stood completely bare, entirely devoid of my family's legacy. I stood in the immaculate foyer and took one final calculating look at the unearned luxury surrounding me. I stepped back out onto the porch and raised my hand. I signaled the lead foreman waiting by the first truck. 10 men dressed in matching gray utility uniforms instantly flooded out of the massive vehicles. They marched up the driveway in perfect synchronization, carrying heavy stacks of reinforced cardboard boxes, industrial packing tape, and thick protective blankets. They functioned like a highly disciplined military unit executing a swift tactical extraction. The foreman approached me with a clipboard, his face entirely devoid of emotion. He asked for my specific instructions regarding the contents of the residential property. I looked past him into the sterile white living room, viewing the expensive furniture not as family heirlooms but as liquidated corporate assets. I ordered the foreman to completely dismantle the entire illusion. I instructed his massive team to aggressively pack absolutely everything inside the structure, from the imported glass chandeliers down to the sterling silverware. The total erasure of his suburban kingdom swiftly commenced right then and there. I stood silently in the center of the sprawling living room and rigidly oversaw the systematic, methodical dismantling of their entire superficial life. The highly efficient moving crew moved with relentless speed around my unmoving figure. 2 burly men carefully hoisted the massive, pristine white Italian leather sofa into the air and began wrapping it securely in thick moving blankets. I had personally written the extravagant $10,000 check for that specific piece of designer furniture as a generous housewarming gift when they first moved in. Heather had proudly claimed the sofa perfectly captured her sophisticated European tastes. I watched them carry my expensive gift directly out the front door and load it into the dark belly of the waiting truck. I turned away and slowly walked down the wooden stairs into the cold, damp, completely unfinished basement to check for any remaining personal items. The concrete floor felt incredibly freezing beneath my polished leather shoes. I scanned the dim, shadowy expanse of the underground space. I spotted a heavily damaged cardboard box shoved carelessly into a dark, leaking corner near the old water heater. I walked over and pulled the damp flaps open. Inside lay Jordan's childhood baseball trophies and a beautiful silver-framed photograph of him tightly hugging his mother Evelyn after a championship game. The protective glass covering her smiling face was violently cracked straight down the middle. The brass trophies we had proudly polished for years were completely covered in thick layers of toxic black mold. He had mercilessly discarded his dead mother's sacred memory into a rotting, flooded basement simply to clear adequate storage space in the upstairs attic for Heather's sprawling seasonal designer shoe collection. The profound visual disrespect solidified the absolute frost in my veins. I picked up the heavy, moldy box of discarded memories and carried it firmly up the steep wooden stairs. I marched straight out the front door and dumped the entire rotting box directly into the massive green trash bin sitting by the quiet neighborhood curb. I wiped the dust from my hands, walked back inside the house, and climbed the carpeted stairs up to Jordan's immaculate home office. The movers were currently unbolting his heavy mahogany desk. They gripped the thick wooden edges and forcefully pulled the massive piece of executive furniture completely away from the painted wall, groaning audibly under the immense weight. I noticed something unusual there. Directly behind the heavy mahogany desk, securely bolted into the lower wooden baseboard and concealed by an expensive Persian rug, was a small, reinforced steel safe. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this hidden security compartment. I turned to the moving foreman standing in the hallway and firmly instructed him to bring his heavy industrial power tools upstairs. I ordered him to drill directly through the electronic combination lock. He retrieved a massive corded drill from his utility belt and pressed the thick titanium bit against the center of the steel keypad. Bright, burning sparks flew wildly across the room, singeing the expensive carpet fibers as the powerful drill violently shattered the internal locking mechanism. The heavy steel door popped open with a harsh metallic grind. I crouched down and reached my hand deep inside the dark cavity. I fully expected to find physical copies of the fraudulent banking documents or the forged signature sheets Jordan used to manipulate the equity loan. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick premium leather legal binder. I pulled the heavy binder out and placed it flat on the bare hardwood floor. The front cover bore the official embossed gold seal of a highly prominent, remarkably aggressive downtown divorce attorney. I flipped the leather cover open and began reading the sharply typed legal text on the very first page. The documents were fully finalized, expertly drafted divorce papers. I checked the official date stamped at the top of the crisp white margin. Heather had meticulously commissioned these severe legal documents exactly 3 months ago. She outlined a highly calculated, utterly ruthless financial strategy to file for immediate separation. Her explicit, documented goal was to permanently seize exactly half of the suburban property's falsely inflated value the exact moment the fraudulent $250,000 equity loan fully cleared into their joint checking account. She was systematically setting Jordan up to take the entire federal fall for the immense banking fraud, while she absconded with half the stolen cash under the guise of an equitable marital dissolution. My son was not just an arrogant thief who had casually betrayed his loving father to impress a superficial woman. He was a blind, pathetic pawn actively participating in his own total destruction. I snapped the thick leather binder shut and stood up. I completely understood exactly what needed to be accomplished next to sever the remaining financial arteries permanently. I left the denuded home office and walked slowly down the carpeted stairs. The heavy boots of the extraction crew had long since faded, leaving behind an absolute ringing silence. I pulled a single metal stool from the corner of the room and placed it beside the massive marble kitchen island. It was the only piece of furniture left in the entire sprawling colonial house. My footsteps and breathing echoed sharply off the bare drywall, emphasizing the total vacuum of the life that once occupied this space. I placed my secure laptop flat on the cold marble surface and booted the encrypted operating system. I bypassed the standard login screens and accessed my primary corporate banking terminal. I navigated directly to the personal banking suite and clicked on the joint accounts profile. I originally opened this specific high-yield checking account the exact day Jordan turned 18 years old. My explicit intention was to teach my son fundamental financial literacy, providing him with a safe, monitored environment to learn how to manage wealth, balance a ledger, and respect the strict discipline of saving. Instead, he weaponized that paternal safety net. A quick glance at the recent transaction history revealed a sickening ledger of unearned excess. Just last week, he used that exact account to purchase highly imported artisanal caviar, specifically requested by Gregory for a lavish dinner party. He used my money to feed the ego of a man who openly despised my existence. The time for financial lessons had permanently expired. I moved my cursor over the bold red master override button at the bottom of the screen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I clicked the button and initiated a total liquidation protocol. The screen refreshed, showing the massive balances in both the checking and savings accounts plummeting instantly to zero. The digital system confirmed the immediate, untraceable transfer of all remaining funds directly into my impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. I selected the final administrative option and permanently closed both accounts, completely shutting down the digital infrastructure that had artificially inflated my son's lifestyle. The first financial artery was successfully severed. I remained seated at the cold kitchen island and smoothly navigated away from the personal banking suite. I opened the highly secure credit management portal associated with my primary corporate umbrella. The screen populated with a long list of active financial instruments. I quickly located the specific authorized user profiles assigned to Jordan and Heather on my exclusive corporate black card. I highlighted both of their digital profiles. With 2 rapid, decisive keystrokes, I permanently revoked their authorized access. their premium metal credit cards currently tucked safely inside their designer wallets on a luxury cruise ship were instantly transformed into entirely useless pieces of heavy plastic. They would be brutally rejected the very next time they attempted to purchase an overpriced cocktail at the ship's premium bar. I clicked over to the automated accounts payable ledger. I scrolled past the legitimate corporate expenses and isolated the recurring monthly autopay profile established for Heather's pristine top-tier luxury SUV. I had foolishly agreed to personally cover the exorbitant astronomical lease on that specific vehicle 3 years ago. Heather had tearfully claimed that utilizing public transportation in the city center was inherently dangerous and completely unacceptable for a woman of her refined social status. I realized with absolute clarity that I had systematically subsidized her boundless arrogance and unearned elitism for 36 consecutive months. I highlighted the recurring billing profile and hit the termination command. The automated payment system instantly canceled the future electronic transfers. However, simply stopping the payments was a passive maneuver. I required aggressive, immediate action. I pulled my smartphone from my breast pocket and dialed the direct, unlisted corporate line of the high-end automotive financing company. An automated voice prompted me through a brief security protocol before transferring my call. I did not ask for a standard customer service representative. I bypassed the lower tiers entirely and firmly demanded to speak directly to the regional repossession manager regarding an actively fraudulent commercial lease. The line clicked twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered the secure channel. The second financial artery was exposed and ready to be decisively cut. The regional repossession manager briskly introduced himself and immediately pulled up the specific lease file on his internal terminal. I provided the vehicle identification number and my corporate security credentials. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I explicitly informed the manager that the secondary financial guarantor signature proudly stamped on the original digital lease agreement was a direct, verifiable forgery. Jordan had confidently forged my signature to secure the ultra-premium lease, heavily assuming I would never notice a simple digital transaction buried deep within my massive corporate expense reports. He firmly believed my administrative oversight was his personal playground. The manager's tone shifted instantly from polite customer service to severe corporate risk management. He recognized the profound legal implications of a fraudulent contract carrying my corporate seal. He immediately flagged the luxury vehicle for an emergency, high-priority recovery operation. I heard the rapid, heavy clicking of his mechanical keyboard as he remotely accessed the vehicle's sophisticated onboard computer network. He tracked the internal GPS signal broadcasting directly from the SUV. The manager read the precise geographic coordinates aloud. He confirmed with absolute certainty that the stolen luxury vehicle was currently parked and locked tightly inside the premium, highly monitored long-term parking lot at the Port of Miami cruise terminal. Jordan and Heather had undoubtedly driven the stolen asset directly to their lavish vacation departure point, leaving it there to wait for their triumphant return. I did not allow the manager to ask for my preferred course of action. I immediately authorized the urgent dispatch of a heavy-duty commercial tow truck. I explicitly instructed him to bypass all standard warning protocols and impound the vehicle before the afternoon sun began to set. The manager agreed to the immediate repossession and promised the truck would arrive at the port within the hour. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the marble island. The pristine luxury vehicle Heather adored would be violently ripped from the cruise terminal and dragged into a secure impound lot long before they even finished unpacking their monogrammed luggage. The final artery was severed. The financial bleeding was permanently stopped. I closed my laptop, stood up from the metal stool, and walked out the front door of the completely empty house. The heavy diesel engines of the 3 unmarked moving trucks roared to life, leading my sedan away from the pristine manicured lawns of the wealthy suburban enclave. We drove exactly 12 miles away from the manicured cul-de-sac, crossing the invisible boundary lines separating extreme wealth from the gritty, functional reality of the city. We arrived at a dilapidated chain-link storage facility situated on the far industrial edge of the county. The cracked asphalt parking lot was heavily stained with dried motor oil and littered with wind-blown debris. I walked into the cramped, poorly lit rental office and paid cash for a single 10x10 concrete unit. I walked back outside and unlocked the heavy, rusted roll-up door. I signaled the moving foreman to begin the final offload. I ordered the exhausted movers to aggressively shove the incredibly expensive imported furniture, the fragile designer clothes, and the highly delicate modern art directly into the cramped metal box. They stacked Heather's pristine white Italian leather sofa vertically against the cold cinder-block wall to save floor space. They crammed heavy mahogany dressers against fragile glass dining tables without any regard for interior design. Heather had constantly boasted to her affluent friends about her flawless open-concept living space, claiming she desperately needed vast amounts of natural light to breathe properly. Her entire curated superficial existence was now violently compressed into a completely windowless, heavily rusted metal cage, smelling strongly of stale dust and industrial exhaust. I stood by the open metal door and watched the brutal physical manifestation of their financial ruin taking shape. Suddenly, a sleek silver luxury sedan swerved aggressively into the gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust. A nosy, highly entitled woman from Jordan's affluent neighborhood aggressively shoved her car into park. She had clearly followed the moving convoy all the way from the suburbs. She jumped out of her vehicle, clutching her smartphone tightly to her ear. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me and began frantically shouting into the receiver. She loudly reported to the emergency dispatcher that an older black man was actively directing a massive organized burglary of her neighbor's expensive property. She demanded immediate police intervention to stop the perceived crime. I simply stood by the open concrete unit and waited for the inevitable arrival of the authorities. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 heavily marked police cruisers violently swerved into the storage facility parking lot with their sirens blaring and their emergency lights flashing blindingly against the rusted metal buildings. The vehicles angled aggressively, deliberately blocking the only exit path for the moving trucks. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their cruisers simultaneously. They left their doors wide open and immediately rested their right hands heavily on their holsters, adopting highly aggressive, combative postures. The lead officer, a young man with a tight jaw and a deeply suspicious glare, marched directly toward me. He demanded in a loud, incredibly hostile voice that I step away from the storage unit immediately and keep my hands completely visible. He ordered me to produce a valid state identification and explain my exact presence at the facility. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice in protest. I remained perfectly calm, anchoring my feet firmly to the cracked asphalt. I had successfully navigated and survived the brutal reality of racial profiling in wealthy suburbs for 4 decades. I knew exactly how this dangerous game was played. Meeting police aggression with righteous anger or sudden movements was a fatal trap designed to justify escalation. Absolute composure and legally binding paperwork were an impenetrable shield. I maintained direct eye contact with the lead officer and spoke in a slow, highly measured, and entirely unthreatening tone. I informed him exactly where my documents were located. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket with deliberate, highly telegraphed movements. I pulled out my thick leather wallet and handed him my valid driver's license. I then reached into my briefcase resting on the hood of my car. I pulled out the authentic notarized municipal deed to the suburban property, along with the heavily certified corporate LLC documents proving my absolute uncontested ownership of the land and everything originally housed upon it. I handed the thick stack of legal papers directly to the lead officer. I informed him firmly that I was not burglarizing a home, but rather liquidating personal corporate assets under my direct legal jurisdiction. I waited in absolute silence while he read the undeniable truth. The lead officer scrutinized the heavy municipal seals and the crisp corporate signatures on the documents. The intense, aggressive hostility completely evaporated from his rigid posture, instantly replaced by a visible wave of stammering, highly uncomfortable apologies. He quickly handed the heavy stack of legal papers back to me, his demeanor completely transformed by the undeniable proof of my wealth and absolute legal authority. He immediately turned his attention away from me and marched directly toward the nosy neighbor still standing by her luxury sedan. He sharply reprimanded the wealthy woman for wasting police resources and filing a completely false, racially motivated police report. He warned her severely about the severe legal consequences of harassing legitimate property owners. He ordered his men to return to their vehicles and quickly backed the cruisers out of the narrow gravel driveway, turning off their flashing emergency lights. The neighbor glared at me with a face entirely flushed red with profound humiliation. She scrambled back into her silver car and sped away from the industrial lot completely defeated. I turned my back to the dusty street and faced the heavy steel roll-up door of the concrete storage unit. The movers had successfully crammed the very last designer box into the tight 10x10 space. I grabbed the metal handle and violently slammed the corrugated steel door shut. The loud metallic crash echoed heavily across the empty lot. I pulled a heavy, solid brass padlock from my coat pocket. I slid the thick metal shackle through the rusted steel latch and snapped it firmly shut. I sealed their entire fabricated life inside a cold, dark vault. The exact moment the heavy brass lock clicked into place, my secure smartphone chimed sharply in my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was a frantic, desperate all-caps text message from Jordan, sent directly from the international terminal in Rome. He urgently demanded an immediate wire transfer of $5,000. He claimed he was experiencing a sudden, highly embarrassing credit card glitch at an exclusive Italian luxury boutique and needed emergency funds to secure a designer handbag for Heather. He was standing half a world away, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction of his kingdom, blindly demanding more of my money to feed his fragile ego. I stared at the message, read the arrogant demand a second time, and locked my phone screen. I stared at the illuminated screen of my smartphone, carefully reading Jordan's frantic, highly entitled demand for a $5,000 emergency wire transfer. He arrogantly claimed a sudden banking error was temporarily holding up a critical luxury purchase in Rome, acting as if I existed solely to serve as his personal financial dispatcher. I typed a single highly calculated word in response to his manufactured crisis: handled. I pressed the send icon and watched the tiny digital receipt confirm the message successfully delivered across the Atlantic Ocean. I immediately opened my operating system's internal contact settings. I selected Jordan's profile and permanently blocked his personal number. I scrolled down the screen, deliberately selected Heather's profile, and permanently blocked her cellular number as well. I placed the heavy smartphone back into my tailored coat pocket, completely severing my digital connection to their fabricated world. Thousands of miles away, the harsh afternoon sun mercilessly baked the ancient cobblestones of Rome. Jordan stood sweating profusely inside a pristine, heavily air-conditioned Italian luxury boutique. The sterile white walls and flawless glass display cases severely amplified his rapidly mounting internal panic. He relied entirely on the uninterrupted illusion of my endless wealth to keep Heather highly compliant and to keep Gregory sufficiently impressed with his manufactured status. Without my hidden financial subsidies operating seamlessly in the background, Jordan was absolutely nothing more than a hollow shell wrapped in a bespoke suit. He nervously wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his brow as Heather admired herself in a tall, full-length mirror, a $5,000 designer handbag draped casually over her shoulder. She tapped her designer heel against the marble floor, fully expecting the routine transaction to quickly conclude with its usual seamless speed. Jordan offered the impeccably dressed boutique clerk a tight, highly anxious smile. He pushed my corporate black card across the polished glass counter, firmly believing my brief text message strictly meant the emergency funds were instantly available. The Italian clerk took the heavy metal card and swiftly swiped it through the sleek electronic terminal. The advanced machine processed the magnetic stripe for a fraction of a second before emitting a sharp, incredibly loud rejection beep. The terminal screen violently flashed a bold, aggressive red "declined" directly across the digital display. The clerk frowned deeply, subtly pulling the payment terminal closer to his chest. Heather stopped admiring her reflection and turned around, quickly crossing her arms with immediate, highly visible impatience. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat entirely dry and completely stripped of any remaining moisture. He offered a breathless, frantic apology to the skeptical clerk, falsely blaming a rigorous fraud prevention hold caused by sudden international travel. His hands shook violently as he frantically opened his designer leather wallet to retrieve a viable backup payment method. He pulled out his primary personal debit card, the exact checking account I had completely liquidated and permanently closed just hours prior. He handed it over to the clerk with a highly desperate, distinctly pleading look in his eyes. The Italian clerk sighed softly and swiped the plastic card through the reader. The terminal beeped its harsh metallic rejection a second time. Jordan's face instantly turned the sickening color of wet chalk. He fumbled blindly through his thick wallet and extracted a secondary high-interest credit card, sliding it forcefully across the glass counter. The clerk swiped it with visibly growing irritation. The screen flashed its final, undeniable denial. The entire luxury boutique fell completely silent. The clerk simply stared at Jordan with thinly veiled contempt, instantly recognizing the distinct, pathetic aura of a desperate man attempting to spend money he clearly did not possess. Gregory stepped forward from the back of the boutique, his face flushed a deep, furious crimson. Gregory prided himself immensely on his absolutely flawless public image and his vast social connections. He came directly from isolated generational wealth and aggressively demanded absolute perfection from his immediate surroundings. To be publicly humiliated inside a high-end European retail store over a blatantly declined credit card completely shattered his carefully maintained facade of aristocratic superiority. He fundamentally viewed acute financial struggle as a severe moral failing, and Jordan was currently failing spectacularly in front of a highly critical international audience. Gregory aggressively shoved his son-in-law aside, physically displacing Jordan from the polished glass counter. He pulled his own heavy platinum card from a silver money clip and slapped it forcefully down onto the surface. He instructed the clerk to immediately run his personal card for the handbag, his voice completely dripping with absolute disgust. The terminal accepted the platinum card instantly. Gregory turned around and looked Jordan directly in the eyes. He did not lower his voice to spare Jordan's fragile feelings. In the middle of the quiet, exclusive boutique, Gregory loudly and brutally insulted Jordan's fundamental financial competence. Gregory aggressively pointed his manicured finger directly at Jordan's chest, completely disregarding the fascinated boutique staff watching this spectacular domestic drama unfold. He loudly labeled Jordan a pathetic, entirely inadequate fake, a weak man pretending to hold substantial wealth while secretly relying on rapidly declining credit lines. He demanded to know exactly why a grown adult masquerading as a highly successful executive could not effortlessly afford a simple routine shopping excursion for his own wife. Jordan looked desperately toward Heather, silently begging for her immediate support or marital intervention to calm her deeply enraged father. Heather did not rush to her husband's defense. She took her father's side instantly, completely abandoning Jordan to the wolves without a single moment of hesitation. She loudly berated Jordan for deeply embarrassing her family and entirely ruining her carefully planned, highly curated vacation aesthetic. She aggressively snatched the heavy shopping bag from the glass counter and stormed directly out of the boutique, closely followed by her seething father. Jordan stood completely alone by the polished counter, absolutely paralyzed by the immediate vicious public rejection. He realized with profound, crushing clarity the purely transactional nature of his entire marriage. The exact moment the money officially stopped flowing from my corporate accounts, his wife's manufactured affection completely evaporated into the hot Italian air. He was clearly only valued as long as he served as an endless provider of uninterrupted luxury. The heavy, suffocating tension permanently destroyed the remainder of their highly anticipated luxury trip. The long, agonizing walk back to the cruise ship terminal was spent in absolute furious silence. Heather walked miles ahead with her father, completely ignoring Jordan's pathetic, scrambling attempts to falsely explain the catastrophic banking glitch. He eventually boarded the massive ocean liner as a broken, totally isolated man, completely unaware that his international problems were only just beginning to materialize. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the humid morning sun slowly crested over the distant horizon, casting a bright golden light across the wealthy, heavily manicured suburbs. The quiet, undisturbed serenity of the affluent neighborhood was abruptly and violently shattered by the deafening roar of heavy diesel engines. 3 massive yellow bulldozers rolled aggressively down the pristine residential street, completely blocking the immaculate suburban cul-de-sac as they stopped directly in front of Jordan's entirely empty, perfectly silent house. I stood firmly on the opposite sidewalk, gripping a battered steel thermos tightly in my calloused hand. The morning air was sharp and crisp, biting at my face, but the hot black coffee radiating through the metal offered a comforting, familiar warmth. Across the pristine, tree-lined suburban street, a massive, highly coordinated demolition crew had completely surrounded the empty colonial house. The heavy diesel engines of 3 enormous yellow bulldozers roared to life, violently shattering the quiet serenity of the affluent neighborhood. The intense vibrations rattled the paved concrete directly beneath my shoes. The lead foreman, wearing a bright orange reflective vest and a heavily scarred hard hat, raised his right hand high into the air. He made a swift, decisive chopping motion, giving the absolute final signal to the primary equipment operator. The massive steel treads of the lead bulldozer lurched forward with a deafening metallic screech. The heavy tracks rolled aggressively over the concrete curb and violently crushed Heather's meticulously manicured flower beds directly into the dark soil. I watched the thick steel obliterate the delicate imported white roses without a single second of hesitation. I had personally paid the exorbitant, heavily inflated landscaping bill for those specific flowers 2 years ago. Heather had loudly complained to her country club friends that the native suburban soil was far too common and entirely unfit for her elevated aesthetic standards. I had subsidized her profound arrogance just to keep the fragile family peace intact. Now those expensive petals were instantly pulverized beneath tons of unforgiving industrial machinery. The heavy machine advanced steadily across the ruined lawn, leaving deep muddy gashes in the perfect green turf. The operator expertly manipulated the hydraulic controls inside the cab. The massive, scarred steel bulldozer blade raised high into the crisp morning air, briefly blocking out the rising sun. It paused for a fraction of a second, hanging ominously over the grand entryway of the suburban castle. Then, with devastating, unyielding force, the heavy blade slammed directly into the custom front door. The heavy oak frame instantly shattered into 1,000 sharp, jagged splinters, exploding inward with a violent crash. The structural integrity of the massive house failed almost instantly under the relentless hydraulic assault. The high-pitched screech of tearing wood and bending iron nails pierced the quiet suburban morning. The pristine, multi-gabled roof caved heavily inward with a sudden deafening crack that echoed like cannon fire down the entire residential block. An immense billowing plume of thick drywall dust and pulverized insulation erupted violently into the bright sky. The heavy gray cloud rolled aggressively across the manicured lawns, coating the neighboring driveways and pristine luxury cars in a fine, suffocating layer of pale powder. The surrounding load-bearing walls collapsed inward upon themselves, folding rapidly like a fragile house of cards. The entire physical illusion of Jordan's unearned success was literally being pulverized directly into the common dirt. I stood completely motionless on the sidewalk and watched the heavy excavator violently crush the imported hardwood floor of the main living room into kindling. A vivid memory flashed briefly in my mind. I distinctly remembered the crisp, bright autumn afternoon I proudly handed Jordan the shiny brass keys to this exact house. He had wrapped his arms around me in a tight embrace and earnestly promised he would spend the rest of his life making me proud. I had worked grueling double shifts at the steel mill just to ensure his absolute future security. Now, standing amidst the roaring machinery and falling debris, I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal grief or regret. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void inside my chest was completely cold and remarkably absolute. The son I had raised died the exact moment he chose to forge my signature and openly mock my legacy to appease his father-in-law. The massive excavators continued their brutal work, methodically ripping apart the remaining framing and crushing the debris into compact, manageable piles. In less than an hour, the sprawling, arrogant suburban house was reduced to a massive smoking pile of shattered rubble and twisted metal. As the heavy dust slowly began to settle over the ruined lot, a sleek black town car smoothly pulled up to the curb beside me. The rear door swung open, and Mr. Gallagher stepped out onto the sidewalk, clutching a thick, tightly sealed legal folder firmly to his chest. Gallagher did not pause to adjust his tailored suit or brush the settling gray dust from his expensive Italian leather shoes. He walked purposefully through the thick, lingering cloud of pulverized drywall directly toward me. He did not offer a polite morning greeting or comment on the absolute destruction occurring right across the street. His face remained carved from solid granite. He stopped just inches away and immediately handed me a crisp, heavy federal banking notice extracted directly from his secure folder. I placed my steel thermos on the hood of his town car and took the document. The bold government-issued seal at the top of the page immediately confirmed the absolute severity of the paperwork. Gallagher explained the rapidly unfolding situation with pure clinical precision. My rapid, unyielding legal liquidation of the suburban property had worked exactly as we intended. By transferring the authentic deed completely out of the blind trust and authorizing an immediate commercial demolition, we had instantly triggered a highly sensitive automated collateral assessment algorithm deep within the national banking network. The massive financial institution's automated security system immediately flagged the severe discrepancy in the underlying paperwork. Jordan's incredibly arrogant attempt to secure a $250,000 cash-out equity loan using that fake, legally hollow ceremonial deed completely failed the bank's emergency stress test. The sudden total disappearance of the physical collateral forced a mandatory human review of the entire loan application. Gallagher adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and delivered the final devastating blow to Jordan's future. The review board instantly recognized the blatant forgery of my corporate signature on the application. The bank did not simply deny the fraudulent loan and close the file. They fundamentally viewed the massive theft attempt as a severe breach of federal law. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially stepped in during the early hours of the morning. Federal agents had completely seized the forged documents directly from the bank's underwriting department. They had officially opened an active, highly aggressive wire fraud and identity theft investigation centered entirely on Jordan and Heather. The uncompromising legal net was closing rapidly around them. They were currently floating somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, blissfully unaware that their permanent, inescapable ruin had already been formalized. The humid, salt-heavy air of the Miami port clung tightly to the massive concrete structures of the premium long-term parking facility. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck, its powerful diesel engine rumbling with a low aggressive vibration, slowly backed into the highly exclusive VIP section of the sprawling lot. The seasoned driver expertly maneuvered the massive, heavily scarred vehicle, his eyes fixed firmly on the wide rear-view mirrors. He deliberately targeted a gleaming, pristine, white luxury SUV sitting arrogantly in the most expensive, heavily secured parking space available. Heather had meticulously customized the expensive vehicle the very week Jordan nervously drove it off the dealership lot. She had completely replaced the factory interior with imported ultra-soft white leather seats and immediately registered a highly obnoxious vanity license plate, boldly broadcasting her newly acquired married name. She consistently treated the heavy machine exactly like a royal carriage, fiercely protecting its flawless exterior and explicitly refusing to ever let Jordan sit behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel. She viewed the vehicle strictly as a rolling monument to her vastly elevated social status, a visible weapon to wield against her less fortunate friends. The tow truck operator shifted his heavy rig into park and hopped down onto the baking asphalt. He did not hesitate or second-guess his clear corporate orders. He grabbed the thick steel chains from the flatbed and quickly positioned the heavy hydraulic lift directly under the front axle of the pristine white SUV. The heavy metal clanked sharply against the concrete, locking securely into place. Suddenly, the shrill blast of a silver whistle pierced the thick, humid afternoon air. A Port Authority security guard rushed frantically across the VIP lot, waving a heavy black flashlight aggressively above his head. He sprinted directly toward the tow truck, his face completely flushed with immediate, unquestionable authority. He loudly demanded that the driver drop the luxury vehicle immediately and step away from the machinery. He placed his hand firmly on the pristine hood of the white SUV, positioning himself as a stubborn physical barrier between the tow operator and Heather's prized possession. The tow truck driver did not react to the security guard's aggressive posturing. He had extracted vehicles from hostile environments for decades and completely understood the absolute power of proper documentation. He remained entirely calm, turning his back on the shouting guard to reach directly into the cab of his truck. He pulled a thick, crisp manila folder from the dashboard and walked slowly back to the front of the pristine SUV. He handed the security guard a highly certified, heavily notarized repossession order. The document bore the massive, undeniable seal of the International Banking Institution, complete with my own verified, authorized signature at the very bottom. Jordan had foolishly forged my digital signature on the initial lease contract to secure the vehicle for Heather, heavily assuming the transaction would remain permanently buried in my sprawling corporate expenses. He fundamentally misunderstood how financial leverage operated in the real world. While he had faked his way into the driver's seat, I completely controlled the massive corporate entity that actually held the underlying debt. The massive banking network always moved exponentially faster to protect a wealthy creditor than it ever would to defend a fraudulent debtor. The security guard shined his heavy flashlight directly onto the crisp paperwork, his eyes scanning the dense legal terminology and the undeniable corporate seals. The belligerent authority instantly drained from his sweaty face. He clearly recognized the absolute, uncompromising weight of a federal banking directive. He sharply nodded his head, handing the thick folder back to the tow truck operator without uttering a single word of protest. The guard immediately took 3 large steps backward, completely removing himself from the operational zone. The tow driver walked back to his external control panel and firmly pulled the primary lever. The heavy hydraulic lift whined with a high-pitched, mechanical squeal. Thick steel cables pulled taut violently, hoisting the front wheels of the pristine luxury SUV completely off the hot Miami pavement. The heavy vehicle lurched upward at a harsh, unnatural angle, perfectly exposing its undercarriage to the humid salt air. The tow truck engine roared as the driver shifted the massive gears into drive. He pulled away from the exclusive VIP parking space with zero regard for the delicate engineering of the luxury vehicle attached to his rig. The heavy truck dragged the pristine white SUV aggressively out of the premium lot and directly toward the steep concrete exit ramp. The harsh, jarring transition over the severe angle caused the rear bumper of Heather's beloved vehicle to violently scrape against the rough pavement. The sickening sound of tearing plastic and grinding metal echoed briefly across the lot, as a long, jagged gash was brutally carved into the flawless white paint. The tow truck did not slow down to assess the superficial damage. It merged seamlessly into the dense, chaotic afternoon traffic of Miami, completely swallowing Heather's rolling monument to arrogance into the endless sea of commercial vehicles. Thousands of miles away, I sat comfortably in the absolute silence of my private, heavily secured study. The afternoon light filtered softly through the heavy wooden blinds. I picked up my sleek iPad from the polished mahogany desk and opened the proprietary automotive tracking application linked directly to the SUV's internal computer. I watched a bright, pulsing digital blip representing the stolen luxury vehicle steadily move further and further away from the Port Authority's geographic zone. I watched the icon travel efficiently toward a highly secured, heavily fortified commercial impound lot located deep within the industrial sector of the city. The physical asset was officially neutralized and entirely out of their reach. I set the tablet down and immediately turned my focused attention to the massive secondary monitor glowing brightly on my desk. I had actively running maritime tracking software displaying the real-time movements of commercial vessels across the globe. I located the specific transponder signal I had been monitoring for the past 48 hours. The massive floating luxury cruise ship currently carrying Jordan, Heather, and Gregory had just officially entered the deep waters of the Miami harbor. The tiny digital icon crept slowly toward the designated passenger terminal. Their highly curated, desperately faked European vacation was officially over. The uncompromising steel trap I had meticulously built around their entire fraudulent existence was now fully set, perfectly loaded, and simply waiting for them to step blindly off the gangway and onto the concrete dock. The massive towering cruise ship finally docked against the concrete pier in Miami, unleashing a flood of exhausted passengers into the oppressive, suffocating afternoon humidity. Jordan, Heather, and Gregory disembarked near the very end of the line, completely stripped of their usual aristocratic energy. They dragged their heavy, oversized designer luggage down the steep metal gangway. Their skin was visibly sunburned, peeling and slick with uncomfortable sweat. Heather complained loudly and incessantly, her shrill voice cutting through the thick salt air. She aggressively criticized the Port Authority for the appalling lack of private priority service, acting as if walking among the general public was a severe personal insult. The devastating financial humiliation they suffered inside that pristine Roman boutique had completely poisoned the remainder of their lavish European vacation. Gregory refused to look at his son-in-law. He simply glared fiercely ahead, his jaw locked in a permanent, unforgiving scowl. He viewed Jordan not as family but as a severe liability who had publicly humiliated him in front of high-end Italian merchants. Jordan silently accepted his severe demotion in the family hierarchy. He walked several paces behind his wife and father-in-law, his shoulders slumped as he strained to carry the heaviest monogrammed leather bags. He functioned entirely like a hired, unpaid porter, desperate to avoid making any sudden movements that might trigger another brutal verbal assault from Gregory. The thick tropical heat made his tailored travel suit stick uncomfortably to his back, but he did not dare pause to rest. He focused entirely on the concrete path ahead, silently praying that returning to their familiar wealthy suburban bubble would magically reset the disastrous family dynamic. Heather marched confidently ahead of the men leading the way directly toward the premium long-term parking facility. She held her expensive electronic key fob high in the air, eager to escape the stifling heat and retreat into the heavily air-conditioned sanctuary of her pristine white luxury SUV. She strutted past the rows of common vehicles and turned sharply into the designated highly secured VIP section. She walked directly up to the specific premium parking space she had reserved weeks in advance. She stopped dead in her tracks. The expensive VIP parking spot was completely and undeniably empty. Heather let out a shrill, piercing scream of pure disbelief. She frantically mashed the panic button on her electronic key fob, repeatedly, desperately expecting the familiar, comforting chirp of the vehicle's security alarm to echo across the concrete garage. Absolute silence answered her frantic clicking. The pristine white luxury vehicle was completely gone, leaving behind nothing but a dark oil stain on the hot asphalt. She immediately spun around and turned her intense, venomous fury directly onto her husband. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger at his chest, loudly accusing him of being completely incompetent and forgetting where he parked her precious, heavily customized vehicle. Jordan dropped the heavy leather luggage directly onto the dirty concrete. Panic surged rapidly through his veins. He sprinted blindly down the adjacent parking aisles, his eyes darting wildly across the rows of parked cars, desperately hoping he had simply misjudged the assigned section. The crushing reality of the missing SUV compounded the intense humiliation he already carried from the European trip. He jogged back to his furious wife, his breath shallow and quick. He attempted to pacify her mounting rage by immediately offering a massive financial concession. He promised to buy her a brand new, entirely upgraded luxury vehicle the very second they returned home. He confidently reminded her about the $250,000 equity loan, firmly believing the massive cash injection was scheduled to fully clear into their joint checking account by Friday afternoon. He aggressively pitched the idea of a custom-ordered interior, desperately using money he did not possess to buy his way out of her immediate wrath. Gregory rolled his eyes in absolute utter disgust at Jordan's pathetic, scrambling display. He had completely lost all patience for his son-in-law's hollow financial promises. Gregory pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket to order a private Uber Black, firmly deciding to completely ignore Jordan's panicked, sweaty search for the missing vehicle. He wanted to escape the humid parking lot and leave the mess entirely for Jordan to solve. Seeing Gregory take control of their transportation, Jordan felt a sudden desperate urge to verify his financial standing. He needed the reassurance of the incoming loan. He pulled out his own phone and quickly opened his secure banking application to check the incoming balance. Jordan stared intently at his high-resolution screen as the banking application attempted to connect to the primary server. The familiar loading circle spun endlessly before completely freezing. The standard dashboard failed to load entirely. Instead, a severe, stark white error message appeared in bold black lettering directly across the center of the display. The text was brutally brief: account permanently suspended. Contact fraud department. Jordan felt the blood instantly drain from his face, leaving his skin completely cold despite the oppressive tropical heat. He frantically closed the application and reopened it, violently tapping the refresh icon with a trembling thumb. The severe error message remained permanently burned onto the screen. He was entirely locked out of his financial existence. The checking account, the savings ledger, the massive credit lines he heavily relied upon to maintain his suburban kingdom were entirely gone, completely walled off by a digital barricade he could not bypass. While Jordan stared blankly at his frozen phone, Gregory growled loudly in pure frustration. The heavy concrete walls of the parking structure and the dense concentration of cruise ship passengers severely disrupted the cellular signal at the port. His premium ride-sharing application crashed repeatedly, completely failing to secure a luxury black car. Furious and deeply uncomfortable in the sweltering heat, Gregory abandoned his technological efforts entirely. He marched aggressively out to the main port thoroughfare and flagged down the very first available vehicle. It was a severely dented, dirty public taxi van with peeling yellow paint and faded commercial decals. The sliding side door squealed loudly as Gregory violently yanked it open. The dark interior smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. Gregory firmly forced a disgusted, highly reluctant Heather into the cramped back seat alongside the heavy luggage. He turned to Jordan, who was still staring in absolute horror at his frozen banking application. Gregory did not invite him into the main cabin. He sharply ordered Jordan to sit in the cramped, incredibly uncomfortable front passenger seat directly next to the sweating driver. Jordan numbly complied, practically falling into the worn fabric seat without uttering a single word of protest. The heavy taxi van lurched forward with a harsh mechanical grind, beginning the long, incredibly humiliating drive back to their upscale, perfectly manicured suburban street. The heavily dented public taxi van violently rattled and shook as it merged onto the bustling interstate highway. The worn suspension groaned under the combined weight of the heavy designer luggage violently shoved into the rear cargo space. Jordan sat rigidly in the cramped front passenger seat, completely pinned between the severely cracked dashboard and the large, sweating driver. The overpowering stench of stale cigarette smoke, cheap pine air freshener, and unwashed upholstery heavily saturated the enclosed cabin. Jordan ignored the suffocating heat and frantically repeatedly restarted his heavily encrypted smartphone. He desperately pressed the power button, watching the glowing corporate logo appear and vanish, praying the catastrophic financial lockout was merely a temporary cellular glitch caused by the dense port infrastructure. Every single time the operating system fully booted, he frantically opened the banking application. Every single time, the exact same severe, bold red error message instantly materialized, confirming his permanent suspension from his own financial existence. Behind him, Heather complained loudly and incessantly about the deeply offensive smell of the ruined taxi interior. She aggressively demanded that Jordan immediately fix the transportation situation, utterly refusing to accept that a woman of her elevated social standing was being subjected to such a degrading public conveyance. Jordan kept his eyes fixed firmly on his dead digital screen. He attempted to pacify his enraged wife by urgently promising her a deep steaming hot bath in their imported marble tub and a heavy glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine, the absolute moment they stepped inside their perfect sprawling colonial house. He leaned entirely on the physical structure of that massive suburban estate to legally and emotionally validate his manufactured worth. That house was his ultimate sanctuary, his undeniable proof of success to Gregory, and his primary tool to keep Heather fully compliant. The long, agonizing drive eventually transitioned from the chaotic, congested city highways to the quiet, highly exclusive residential avenues. The manicured lawns, pristine brick sidewalks, and towering ancient oak trees began to smoothly glide past the smudged windows of the dirty van. The taxi driver noticeably slowed his speed heavily, leaning forward over the steering wheel to carefully read the polished brass address numbers mounted on the pristine concrete curbs. The heavy taxi van squealed its worn brakes and rolled to a complete shuddering halt directly beside the assigned curb. The driver threw the gear shift into park and loudly announced their arrival. Jordan eagerly looked out the smudged passenger window, desperate to see his massive, pristine colonial sanctuary. He blinked rapidly, his mind completely failing to process the visual information presented to him. There was no sprawling colonial house. There was no expansive, multi-tiered cedar deck. There was no perfectly paved, sweeping, circular driveway. The entire physical structure had been utterly eradicated. In its place sat a massive, completely flattened square of heavily packed, tread-marked dirt. A cheap temporary chain-link fence hastily erected and secured with thick metal wire entirely surrounded the barren perimeter. Jordan stared blankly at the massive void, utterly paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the absolute erasure. Over the past 3 years, Heather had relentlessly and viciously tormented her affluent neighbors. She consistently filed aggressive, highly detailed complaints with the Homeowners Association regarding the precise length of their grass, the specific shade of their exterior paint, and the exact placement of their seasonal decorations. She loudly and frequently claimed her immaculate property was the undisputed crown jewel of the entire street. Now her highly curated, heavily defended kingdom was literally pulverized into the common, unkempt soil. The pristine illusion of Jordan's success had been violently crushed and completely hauled away in a fleet of heavy industrial dump trucks. Standing directly in the dead center of the packed dirt lot was a massive newly erected commercial billboard heavily staked deep into the ground. The bright, glossy sign featured bold, aggressive red letters screaming a highly corporate message directly at the quiet neighborhood. It read, "Future home of Apex Retail Plaza." Heather violently kicked the back of Jordan's seat. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream of pure, unadulterated rage and aggressively attacked the confused taxi driver. She viciously accused him of being entirely incompetent and deliberately driving them to the wrong residential subdivision. Heather aggressively pounded her manicured fists against the plexiglass divider, loudly insisting the bewildered driver had purposely brought them to the wrong wealthy neighborhood. She demanded he instantly turn the dirty van around and locate her actual property. Jordan completely ignored his wife's escalating hysteria. He slowly pulled the heavy metal handle and stepped out of the cramped taxi van onto the pristine concrete sidewalk. His expensive leather shoes hit the pavement, but his legs completely lost their structural integrity. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to briefly lean his heavy weight against the dented side panel of the idling vehicle. He looked wildly up and down the quiet, perfectly manicured street. The overwhelming, suffocating reality violently crushed his chest. He immediately recognized the distinct architectural designs of the surrounding neighboring houses. He recognized the massive ancient oak tree casting a long, familiar shadow in the yard directly to his left. He recognized the exact curvature of the street corner. This was absolutely undeniably his designated address. He pushed himself away from the dirty van and walked with slow, highly unsteady, zombie-like steps directly toward the edge of the flattened dirt lot. He stopped right before the temporary chain-link barricade. He visually scanned the absolute destruction, searching for any remaining fragment of his former existence. The heavy demolition equipment had been brutally thorough. The only physical structure left standing on the entire sprawling property was the heavy black metal mailbox secured firmly to a wooden post at the very end of the curb. It stood entirely alone, acting as a grim, solitary tombstone for a completely fabricated life. Jordan approached the metal box. He reached out with severely trembling fingers and slowly pulled the heavy metal flap downward. Sitting perfectly centered inside the dark metallic cavity was a thick, heavily packed manila envelope. He recognized the sharp, aggressive black ink instantly. His full legal name was written precisely across the front cover in my unmistakable, unyielding handwriting. He reached his shaking hand inside the hot metal box and pulled the heavy envelope out into the bright afternoon sun. Jordan violently tore the heavy manila envelope open, his hands shaking with an uncontrollable, frantic tremor. The thick paper gave way, and a single heavy brass key dropped directly onto the dusty pavement, striking the concrete curb with a sharp, distinct chime. He bent down to retrieve the cold metal, his pristine trousers brushing against the settling gray demolition dust of his vanished estate. Reaching back inside the torn envelope, he pulled out a neatly folded, brightly printed map. The paper detailed a highly specific route leading entirely out of their wealthy, perfectly manicured suburban enclave and directing him straight toward the crumbling, heavily industrialized edge of the city. Stapled securely to the top right corner of the printed map was a crisp white index card. I had deliberately written a single incredibly precise sentence across the thick cardstock using my favorite fountain pen. It read, "Your life is in box 402. Jordan stared blankly at the sharp black ink, his mind completely failing to process the brutal reality of those words. Before he could even attempt to formulate a coherent thought, the heavy passenger door of the public taxi van was violently shoved open. Gregory stepped out onto the dusty pavement, his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The absolute shock of the missing house had entirely bypassed any normal human confusion and mutated directly into pure, unadulterated rage. Gregory aggressively marched across the flattened dirt lot, his expensive leather shoes kicking up small, bitter clouds of gray dust. He closed the distance in seconds, grabbed Jordan violently by the shoulder, and physically spun his son-in-law around. Gregory screamed directly into Jordan's face, aggressively demanding to know exactly where his daughter's multi-million-dollar suburban house went, his spit flying into the hot afternoon air. Jordan stammers pathetically, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence to explain the sheer impossibility of an entirely vanished estate. He opened his mouth repeatedly, but only weak, breathless gasps escaped his bone-dry throat. Seeing this pathetic, cowardly display of total incompetence, Gregory entirely lost the very last remaining shred of his carefully guarded temper. The meticulously constructed mask of polite aristocratic high society violently shattered right there on the dusty suburban sidewalk. Gregory unleashed a relentless, incredibly vicious torrent of racially coded insults, his booming voice echoing loudly down the previously quiet, affluent street. He aggressively jabbed his manicured finger painfully deep into Jordan's chest, calling him nothing more than a pathetic, low-level street hustler playing an elaborate, fraudulent game of dress-up with stolen money. Gregory loudly revealed the deep, venomous prejudice he had carefully hidden behind fake smiles and country club handshakes for the past 3 years. He explicitly stated that he always knew a black man from the gritty inner city could never genuinely provide the elevated, luxurious lifestyle his refined daughter truly deserved. He brutally summarized Jordan's entire existence as a cheap, temporary illusion bound to fail. Jordan looked desperately toward the open door of the idling taxi, silently begging his wife to intervene and immediately stop the brutal verbal assault. Heather did not step forward. She did not offer a single word of marital defense for her humiliated husband. She remained safely inside the dirty van, sobbing hysterically into her hands, and loudly demanding that Jordan immediately fix this catastrophic nightmare. She ordered him to magically restore her stolen luxury and reconstruct her missing house. Completely broken and utterly humiliated by the two superficial people he had sacrificed his own father to impress, Jordan turned away. He aggressively shoved the printed map directly through the open window of the taxi, hitting the driver square in the chest. He barked a frantic, desperate order, demanding the driver take them immediately to the highlighted industrial district. The dented public taxi van violently accelerated away from the pristine, manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs, leaving the pulverized remains of Jordan's false kingdom completely behind in the dusty rearview mirror. The driver navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with reckless speed, plunging aggressively into the gritty, neglected, warehouse-lined streets of the city's forgotten industrial zone. The smooth, tree-shaded avenues were rapidly replaced by cracked, pothole-ridden asphalt, towering rusted chain-link fences, and heavily abandoned commercial buildings. The suffocating air instantly changed completely, abandoning the fresh scent of blooming suburban jasmine for the harsh metallic stench of heavy diesel exhaust and openly burning trash. It was the exact gritty environment Jordan had spent his entire adult life, desperately running away from the precise socio-economic reality he had relentlessly abandoned his heritage to permanently escape. Now, the dirty taxi carried him directly back into the very heart of his deepest insecurities. The van violently bounced over a set of rusted railroad tracks and pulled up to the imposing, heavily chained gates of the dilapidated storage facility. The driver abruptly threw the vehicle into park, the worn engine sputtering loudly in the oppressive, stagnant heat. Jordan pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out onto the oil-stained concrete. His tailored Italian suit looked entirely absurd and pathetic against the backdrop of decaying urban infrastructure. He slowly raised his eyes, visually scanning the long, bleak row of identical, windowless concrete storage units. Standing perfectly still beside the heavily rusted metal door of Unit 402 was me. I was dressed impeccably in a sharply tailored navy blue suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding authority amidst the industrial decay. I did not smile, and I did not move a single muscle to greet him. Standing perfectly rigid right beside me was my chief legal counsel, Mr. Gallagher. He tightly clutched his thick leather briefcase to his chest, the polished silver clasps glinting sharply under the harsh industrial sun. We waited in absolute, terrifying silence as my son finally realized the inescapable permanence of his new reality. Heather's eyes locked onto my position the exact second Jordan froze in the parking lot. She pushed past her paralyzed husband and charged directly across the cracked, oil-stained asphalt. Her expensive stiletto heels clicked aggressively against the rough concrete, echoing like rapid gunfire in the desolate industrial canyon. She closed the distance between us with terrifying speed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She completely ignored Mr. Gallagher. She stopped inches from my face and screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know exactly what the crazy old man had done with her multi-million-dollar home and her imported custom furniture. I stood perfectly motionless and simply looked at her flushed, furious face. The sheer volume of her voice was completely familiar. For the past 3 years, Heather had deliberately spoken to me slowly and loudly at every single holiday dinner. She constantly over-articulated her syllables, treating my decades of grueling blue-collar steel mill labor as if it had severely and permanently limited my cognitive abilities. She viewed my calloused hands as definitive proof of profound intellectual deficiency, completely convinced my mere presence in her dining room was a charitable act on her part. I let her scream until her lungs desperately gasped for the humid, diesel-choked air. Realizing her volume was generating absolutely zero reaction, Heather abruptly shifted her aggressive tactics. She plunged her hand into her designer purse and violently yanked out her sleek iPhone. She shoved the high-resolution camera directly into my face, the recording light already flashing a bright, hostile red. She loudly and theatrically threatened to call the police right that very second. She promised to have me arrested, humiliated, and locked away for massive grand burglary and illegal forceful eviction. I did not flinch, step back, or attempt to block the camera lens. I maintained my absolute icy composure. I slowly raised my right hand, pointing directly at the glowing device in her manicured grip. I calmly and firmly instructed her to stop threatening and actually make the call. I told her the local authorities would find the resulting conversation incredibly enlightening. Heather visibly hesitated. My absolute, uncompromising lack of fear completely derailed her rehearsed theatrical escalation. Her manicured thumb hovered nervously over the emergency dial icon, her aggressive momentum instantly colliding with a wall of pure, terrifying confidence. She lowered the glowing screen slightly, completely unsure of her next move. Sensing his daughter's sudden tactical retreat, Gregory immediately marched forward to seize total control of the confrontation. He violently shoved his way to the front, physically stepping directly between Heather and me. He puffed out his broad chest, artificially expanding his physical presence in a pathetic attempt to use his physical size and perceived aristocratic authority to completely intimidate me. He aggressively pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at my sternum, stopping just a fraction of an inch from making physical contact with my tailored navy suit. His voice dropped into a low, menacing, and deeply arrogant growl. He explicitly informed me that he kept the most aggressive, incredibly powerful corporate litigators in the entire state on a permanent, exceptionally lucrative retainer. He loudly promised to weaponize his massive legal apparatus against me. He swore he would personally bury my entire existence under an inescapable avalanche of catastrophic civil lawsuits. He listed grand theft, massive property destruction, and extreme emotional distress as his opening salvos. He fully expected me to instantly wither under the crushing weight of his immense financial superiority, firmly believing a retired mill worker could never withstand the wrath of high society lawyers. I did not retreat. I stepped forward, closing the microscopic gap between us. I looked Gregory directly in the eye, entirely refusing to break contact or acknowledge his pathetic, inflated posturing. I did not raise my voice a single decibel to match his frantic, sweating aggression. I maintained absolute, chilling silence for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, without breaking my unyielding stare, I simply gave a sharp, deliberate nod to Mr. Gallagher, standing quietly to my right. Gallagher stepped forward instantly. He placed his heavy leather briefcase flat onto the rusted hood of an abandoned pickup truck sitting adjacent to Unit 402. The dual golden latches snapped open with a sharp, echoing, and terrifyingly definitive crack. Mr. Gallagher smoothly lifted the heavy leather lid of his briefcase and reached inside. He extracted a thick, perfectly bound stack of highly certified legal documents. The heavy paper bore crisp, undeniable municipal seals and verified county watermarks reflecting brightly in the harsh industrial sunlight. Gallagher pivoted efficiently and handed the dense legal stack directly to Gregory's waiting hands. Gregory violently snatched the paperwork from the attorney, a sneer of pure aristocratic arrogance firmly cemented onto his flushed, sweating face. He aggressively adjusted his posture, supremely confident his vastly superior intellect would easily locate a gaping technicality or a pathetic procedural error to immediately exploit. Gregory aggressively snapped the first page open. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense paragraphs of highly specialized legal terminology. The confident, condescending sneer on his face instantly faltered, completely dropping away to reveal a sudden, undeniable flicker of profound confusion. He rapidly flipped to the second page, his thumb smudging the crisp white paper. He read the subsequent paragraphs with a frantic, desperate intensity. The deep crimson anger completely drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Mr. Gallagher did not wait for Gregory to process his complete and total defeat. Gallagher began to speak in a flat, clinical, entirely monotone voice that easily sliced through the humid air. He methodically detailed the precise, unassailable contents of the documents Gregory was desperately gripping. He calmly explained the existence of the authentic, heavily secured property deed. He clearly outlined the complex, utterly impenetrable LLC holding structure that legally insulated the entire estate from any external claims or marital disputes. He concluded by plainly stating the absolute, unimpeachable legality of the massive commercial sale recently finalized with the commercial retail developer. The heavy machinery that had pulverized the colonial estate had acted under a completely legitimate, heavily authorized corporate demolition order. Gallagher adjusted his glasses and delivered the final, devastating clarification to the silent, trembling group. The sprawling suburban castle had simply never been Jordan's actual property to leverage, sell, or occupy. The entire foundation of their arrogant existence was built on an illusion they never possessed. Jordan violently pushed past his stunned father-in-law. Desperation radiated from his sweating face as he reached deep into the interior pocket of his ruined designer jacket. He forcefully yanked out a sharply folded piece of heavy parchment paper. It was the heavily embossed ceremonial deed I had handed him years ago on the crisp autumn afternoon he moved into the estate. He aggressively thrust the paper directly toward Mr. Gallagher's chest, his voice cracking as he loudly shouted that he held the true, undeniable proof of absolute ownership. I watched my son brandish the completely hollow document with a profound sense of tragic irony. For years, he genuinely believed his blue-collar father was entirely uneducated, assuming a retired steelworker was completely incapable of understanding the fundamental legal difference between a commemorative novelty certificate and a highly restricted notarized municipal title. He had proudly built his entire suburban kingdom on the arrogant assumption of my profound ignorance, utterly convinced his corporate vocabulary made him untouchable. Mr. Gallagher did not raise his hand to accept the document. He did not even break eye contact with Jordan to look at the paper. Instead, Gallagher delivered a cold, clinical verbal dismantling that echoed harshly across the cracked concrete of the industrial lot. He explicitly informed Jordan that presenting a legally hollow, completely fabricated document to a corporate entity did not magically grant him sudden equity in a demolished property. He clearly explained that wielding that specific piece of paper only provided the banking network with absolute physical proof of his deliberate intent to commit massive wire fraud. Gallagher systematically outlined the severe federal penalties for attempting to secure a $250,000 loan using fraudulent collateral. The sharp, uncompromising legal reality struck Jordan with the force of a physical blow. The aggressive, arrogant posture completely vanished from his frame. The heavy parchment paper suddenly looked utterly ridiculous in his trembling grip. Defeated and entirely stripped of his false authority, Jordan let his hand drop limply to his side, the worthless deed fluttering briefly in the humid breeze before settling against his thigh. He was completely out of options and entirely out of lies. Heather stared blankly at Jordan's defeated posture, the complete realization of their total financial ruin finally penetrating her aristocratic delusions. The sprawling house was entirely gone, the luxury vehicle was impounded, and the massive bank loan was permanently blocked. Recognizing the absolute destruction of her suburban kingdom, she instantly executed a ruthless pivot. She entirely abandoned her furious demands regarding the missing estate and immediately focused on pure, selfish preservation. She aggressively marched toward the rusted metal door of Unit 402, her high heels clicking sharply against the oil-stained asphalt. She loudly demanded immediate access to the storage facility, frantically insisting she needed to retrieve her expensive jewelry, her imported designer handbags, and her secure passport so she could permanently leave this industrial nightmare. I moved seamlessly, stepping deliberately in front of the heavy steel padlock securing the rolling door. I blocked her path with my physical presence, denying her the easy escape she so desperately craved. Without breaking eye contact with my furious daughter-in-law, I reached over to the hood of the rusted truck and pulled a secondary bright red file directly from Mr. Gallagher's open leather briefcase. The thick folder contained the exact stack of highly confidential documents I had meticulously extracted from her hidden digital safe just hours before the heavy excavators pulverized the master bedroom. Heather's eyes widened in sudden raw panic as she instantly recognized the specific red binding. I forcefully shoved the thick file directly into her trembling hands. I did not whisper or attempt to soften the devastating revelation. I turned slightly and announced loudly, ensuring my voice clearly reached Gregory and Jordan standing just a few feet away. I explicitly detailed that the red folder contained fully drafted, heavily notarized divorce papers bearing Heather's verified signature. I methodically explained the cold, calculated timeline clearly outlined in her secret legal documents. Heather had meticulously planned to formally file for divorce and legally seize exactly half of Jordan's newly acquired assets the absolute minute that massive, fraudulent equity loan fully cleared the banking network. She had never viewed Jordan as a permanent partner, but merely as a highly disposable financial vessel waiting to be brutally capsized the moment his utility expired. Jordan stood entirely paralyzed on the cracked asphalt, staring at his wife in absolute, unadulterated horror. The blood completely drained from his face as the magnitude of her hidden betrayal violently crashed down upon him. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward and desperately reached out for the red file. Heather violently flinched away from his extended hand, clutching the thick folder tightly against her chest like a physical shield. Her wide, panicked eyes darted wildly around the gritty industrial park, desperately searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. She opened her mouth to speak, to deploy one of her highly effective manipulative lies, but her voice completely failed her. She could not possibly deny the absolute truth written in sharp black ink across the pages she held against her heart. The devastating reality completely shattered Jordan's entire worldview. He had systematically alienated his devoted father, actively stolen from his own family legacy, and willingly committed massive federal wire fraud strictly to impress a woman who viewed him solely as a temporary, highly disposable financial stepping stone. He had permanently traded genuine, unconditional love for a heavily calculated, utterly hollow performance. He had literally destroyed his own life to secure a future with a woman actively plotting his absolute ruin. Recognizing the complete collapse of her carefully managed suburban illusion, Heather frantically turned her attention back to her father. She practically lunged toward Gregory, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She loudly begged her father to immediately call his lawyers and physically extract her from the filthy industrial zone. Jordan stumbled forward, completely ignoring Gregory's hostile presence. He desperately grabbed Heather's arm, begging her with a broken, pathetic whimper to explain the drafted divorce papers, pleading for a single rational excuse to salvage their broken marriage. Before Heather could even attempt to construct a response, the loud roar of a powerful, heavy engine completely drowned out their chaotic argument. A massive, heavily tinted black government SUV aggressively turned off the main industrial road. The heavy vehicle violently accelerated directly into the storage facility parking lot, its thick tires kicking up a massive cloud of dirty gravel as it sped straight toward our position. The heavy black government SUV slammed its brakes, skidding to a violent halt just yards away from the idling taxi van. Thick gray dust swirled aggressively around the massive tires, heavily coating the cracked asphalt and filling the stagnant air. Jordan completely ignored the incredibly intimidating vehicle. His fragile mind was actively spiraling into a state of absolute unrecoverable panic. He turned his desperate, heavily sweating face back to me, his voice cracking with pathetic, raw terror. He stumbled forward, closing the physical distance between us, practically dropping to his knees on the filthy industrial concrete. He begged me with a frantic, breathless whimper to immediately unlock the joint bank accounts. He loudly promised to use the $15,000 from the Mediterranean cruise upgrade to quickly secure a temporary luxury hotel room for Heather and Gregory. He babbled relentlessly, desperately trying to negotiate a temporary financial truce using funds he fundamentally did not possess. I did not offer a single word of paternal comfort. I smoothly reached into the interior pocket of my tailored navy suit and pulled out my secure smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen, opened my primary corporate banking application, and quickly navigated to the flagged transaction ledger. I tapped the high-resolution screen, pulling up the specific, highly detailed fraud alert regarding the permanently frozen $15,000 charge. I held the glowing device up high in the humid air, positioning it perfectly so Gregory could read the stark red financial data clearly. I spoke with absolute uncompromising volume, ensuring every single syllable echoed harshly against the rusted corrugated metal of the storage units. I explicitly announced to the entire assembled group that the lavish European cruise upgrade was never a generous gift from a highly successful, wealthy son-in-law. I methodically detailed exactly how Jordan had cowardly forged my digital signature and illegally siphoned the money directly from my heavy corporate line of credit strictly to fund Gregory's opulent vacation. I laid out the undeniable, humiliating truth that Jordan had literally stolen from the very man Gregory actively despised just to artificially inflate his fragile status within their insular high society. Gregory stood completely frozen on the cracked pavement, staring directly at the digital corporate ledger glowing brightly on my high-resolution screen. The brutal financial realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow to the chest. For his entire adult life, Gregory had fiercely prided himself on his meticulously crafted, self-made narrative, constantly boasting to his peers about his profound financial independence and his vastly superior economic intellect. Now the undeniable, heavily documented truth permanently destroyed his arrogant foundation. He suddenly understood that his luxurious first-class transatlantic flights, his imported vintage European wine, and his sprawling Mediterranean luxury suite were all heavily subsidized by outright pathetic theft. His pristine, highly curated vacation had been entirely funded by stolen money. Gregory slowly shifted his horrified gaze away from the smartphone and looked directly down at my resting hands. He stared intently at the thick, permanent calluses, the rough skin, and the deep scars earned from 4 decades of grueling, relentless labor in the extreme heat of the steel mill. He then turned his utterly disgusted eyes toward Jordan, who was still trembling pathetically on the filthy asphalt. The crushing, undeniable irony physically sickened Gregory. He finally realized that the blue-collar black man he had openly and viciously despised just moments ago was the sole undeniable reason he had just enjoyed a week of unparalleled European luxury. He had unknowingly consumed the very sweat and labor he considered fundamentally beneath him. As Gregory literally choked on the bitter taste of his own hypocrisy, the heavy armored doors of the black government SUV simultaneously swung open with a heavy mechanical clank. Two tall, broad-shouldered men stepped out into the humid, diesel-choked industrial park. They wore sharp, perfectly identical dark windbreakers and heavy, polarized tactical sunglasses that completely masked their facial expressions. They did not wear the standard recognizable blue uniforms of the local municipal police department. They did not carry the relaxed, casual posture of privately hired corporate security contractors. They moved with absolute, undeniable, and deeply intimidating federal authority. Their heavy tactical boots crunched rhythmically against the loose gravel as they perfectly synchronized their aggressive approach. The sheer, overwhelming weight of their presence instantly suffocated the remaining family arguments, plunging the dusty lot into a heavy, utterly terrified silence. The two imposing men closed the distance across the cracked asphalt with calculated, highly trained, unhurried precision. They bypassed Heather's hysterical sobbing and Gregory's paralyzed ashen shock, entirely focusing their attention on the center of the confrontation. The taller of the two men stopped exactly 3 feet away from the edge of our group. He reached a thick, steady hand deep inside the interior breast pocket of his dark nylon windbreaker. He smoothly produced a heavy black leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp, practiced snap of his wrist. A bright, unmistakable gold federal shield caught the harsh, unfiltered afternoon sun. He explicitly identified himself and his silent partner as special agents operating directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice possessed the flat, uncompromising tone of a man who dealt exclusively in absolute, inescapable ruin. Jordan took a sharp, highly unstable step backward. His expensive leather shoes dragged loudly across the dirty gravel, nearly causing him to trip over his own discarded luggage. His breath caught violently in his tight throat, creating a sickening, suffocating, choking sound. The blood completely rushed from his head as the devastating legal reality finally connected within his panicked, fragmented mind. The severe automated banking alert generated by his highly arrogant, completely fraudulent equity loan attempt had not simply declined the financial transaction. It had immediately triggered a mandatory high-level federal security review. His desperate amateur attempt to illegally leverage a fake municipal deed against a $250,000 cash payout had officially summoned the absolute highest tier of national law enforcement. He was no longer dealing with angry, insulted family members or aggressive local debt collectors. He was now facing the full, crushing, and uncompromising weight of the United States government. The lead federal agent did not lower his gold badge. He slowly and deliberately scanned the faces of the terrified, completely silent group, his polarized lenses reflecting the rusted metal of the commercial storage units. He ignored the dirty public taxi van and the scattered, useless designer bags completely. He squared his broad shoulders, planting his heavy tactical boots firmly on the oil-stained ground. He asked a single devastating question in a cold, entirely professional voice that left absolutely zero room for negotiation, delay, or escape. "Which one of you is Jordan Maxwell?" The question hung heavily in the thick, diesel-choked air of the industrial park, demanding an immediate answer. Before Jordan could even draw a shallow breath to respond, Heather moved. There was absolutely zero hesitation, not a single fraction of a second wasted on marital loyalty or shared shock. She violently shoved Jordan away from her, her hands striking his chest hard enough to make him stumble backward over his own heavy designer luggage. She immediately raised her perfectly manicured finger and pointed it directly at his flushed, sweating face. For years, Jordan had systematically alienated his own blood, drained his family's legacy, and willingly committed massive federal wire fraud strictly to protect and inflate his wife's incredibly fragile ego. He had served as her devoted, unwavering shield against any perceived slight or financial inconvenience. Now faced with the terrifying, uncompromising reality of federal consequences, she sacrificed him with the blinding, thoughtless speed of a biological reflex. She did not even look at him. Heather turned her frantic, panicked eyes directly toward the two stern federal agents and began to scream. Her voice reached a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed painfully off the rusted, corrugated metal of the storage units. She loudly and desperately declared that she had absolutely no knowledge of any financial crimes, banking anomalies, or forged municipal documents. She aggressively threw her husband to the wolves, frantically claiming that Jordan completely and exclusively controlled all of the money, the mortgages, and the corporate accounts. She wildly painted herself as a naive, completely innocent victim who had been deliberately kept in the dark by a manipulative, deceitful partner. She took a step toward the agents, tears streaming down her sunburned face, and explicitly demanded their immediate, unconditional protection from the man she had just sworn to love and honor. She completely disavowed the expensive clothes on her back and the luxury vacation she had just enjoyed, loudly insisting that she was utterly blind to how Jordan funded their lavish existence. The second federal agent completely ignored Heather's hysterical, theatrical performance. His face remained carved from solid granite, entirely unmoved by her desperate tears or her frantic attempts to distance herself from the crime. He smoothly reached into the interior pocket of his dark windbreaker and pulled out a thick, sharply folded arrest warrant. He stepped directly toward Jordan, establishing a dominant physical presence that instantly silenced Heather's frantic sobbing. In a flat, highly clinical voice, the agent explicitly outlined the severe mechanics of Jordan's inevitable downfall. He informed my son that the desperate attempt to secure a $250,000 equity loan using a legally hollow, heavily forged ceremonial deed had not merely triggered a local banking error. Because the massive financial institution routed its primary loan approvals through heavily secured servers located across the country, Jordan's electronic submission of the fraudulent collateral officially crossed state banking lines. The act instantly elevated his desperate scheme from a localized corporate dispute into a severe multi-state federal offense. As the agent systematically read the crushing legal reality, Jordan slowly turned his head and locked his wide, terrified eyes directly onto mine. His gaze was entirely desperate, silently pleading with me to immediately step forward and correct the agents. He stood there on the cracked asphalt, waiting for me to magically deploy a hidden legal maneuver or offer a massive financial settlement to wipe the slate clean. He fundamentally expected me to step in and entirely absorb his severe punishment, exactly as I had silently absorbed his profound disrespect and arrogance for years. He truly believed his blue-collar father would once again serve as his ultimate, infallible safety net. I did not move. I maintained my cold, unyielding silence, refusing to throw him a single lifeline. The lead agent stepped forward, flanking his partner, and loudly announced the official, inescapable charges. The words struck the humid air with brutal finality: felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and uttering a forged instrument. The agent then reached to his heavy tactical belt, pulled out a pair of solid steel handcuffs, and calmly instructed Jordan to place his hands behind his back. The direct, uncompromising command finally shattered the very last pillar of Jordan's psychological endurance. The physical reality of the heavy steel cuffs glinting in the harsh industrial sunlight was simply too massive for his fragile ego to process. His knees violently gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward, his tailored Italian suit sliding roughly down the heavily rusted corrugated metal door of Unit 402. He hit the oil-stained concrete with a dull, pathetic thud, kicking up a small cloud of toxic gray dust. He frantically pulled his knees to his chest and tightly crossed his arms over his torso, absolutely refusing to comply with the federal agent's direct order to secure his hands. He began to hyperventilate, issuing short, rapid gasps of pure, unadulterated terror. The two agents did not hesitate, pause, or attempt to verbally negotiate with the broken man on the ground. They moved in swiftly and with absolute practiced efficiency. They grabbed Jordan firmly by the shoulders of his ruined designer jacket and forcefully hauled his dead weight upward, forcing him to stand upright on his severely trembling legs. I stood perfectly still next to Mr. Gallagher and watched the federal agents physically handle my son. A vivid, painful montage of memories flashed briefly in my mind. I distinctly remembered the patient, quiet afternoons I spent teaching him how to tie his small shoes on the front porch of our modest home. I remembered running behind him on the cracked suburban pavement, tightly holding the seat of his bicycle until he finally found his balance. I remembered teaching him how to give a firm handshake and look a grown man directly in the eye with absolute integrity. I had poured my entire soul into forging a strong, honorable man capable of surviving the world. Now I watched him weep openly on the dirty asphalt, crying exactly like a cornered coward who had entirely traded his moral compass for an empty, shallow illusion. As the cold steel ratcheted tightly and loudly around his wrists, locking him into his new reality, Jordan violently twisted his head away from the agents and looked directly toward Gregory. His face was slick with heavy sweat and desperate tears. He completely abandoned his pride and begged the very man who had just hurled vicious racist insults at him minutes prior. He cried out into the humid air, desperately pleading with his father-in-law to immediately call his powerful, highly retained corporate litigators and deploy his massive wealth to post his federal bail. The heavy, sharp click of the federal handcuffs engaging echoed loudly across the cracked concrete of the industrial parking lot. The harsh metallic sound sliced cleanly through the humid air, instantly silencing Heather's hysterical theatrical sobbing. The two agents moved with practiced, unyielding efficiency, securing Jordan's wrists tightly behind his back and thoroughly checking the tension of the heavy steel chains. They completely ignored his frantic, breathless whimpers. Gregory stood perfectly still, staring at his son-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The aristocratic patriarch did not reach for his sleek smartphone. He did not bark orders to his powerful corporate litigators. He did not attempt to post bail or offer a single syllable of legal assistance. Gregory possessed a vicious, highly developed instinct for social survival. He instantly calculated the catastrophic collateral damage of Jordan's massive federal offenses. Any public or private association with a man formally charged with severe wire fraud and document forgery would instantly and permanently vaporize his own carefully cultivated pristine reputation within their exclusive wealthy circles. He recognized the absolute toxicity of the situation and immediately executed a ruthless, permanent amputation. Gregory grabbed his daughter roughly by the upper arm, his grip visibly tight and unyielding. He violently yanked a stunned Heather completely away from her handcuffed husband, dragging her aggressively toward the open door of the idling, dirty public taxi van. She stumbled over the rough asphalt, completely failing to resist her father's sudden, brutal authority. Gregory shoved her into the cramped back seat alongside the heavy designer luggage and slammed the sliding door shut with a deafening crash. He rounded the rear of the van, pulled open the passenger door, and barked a single furious order at the bewildered driver. He demanded the man drive them directly to the international airport immediately, completely abandoning the ruined suburban dream and the arrested husband without casting a single backward glance. Jordan stood trembling uncontrollably. His shoulders slumped as he watched the dented taxi van violently accelerate away from the storage facility. The vehicle kicked up a thick cloud of toxic gray dust, quickly vanishing into the heavy afternoon traffic of the industrial zone. He was entirely alone, physically restrained, and completely abandoned by the superficial family he had sacrificed his own soul to impress. The lead federal agent did not offer a moment of sympathy or pause for the dramatic exit. He positioned himself directly in front of Jordan and began to read the mandatory Miranda warning. His voice was completely monotonous, highly practiced, and entirely devoid of human emotion. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent stated the words, hanging heavily in the thick, diesel-choked air. I stood perfectly still next to Mr. Gallagher, silently watching the severe legal protocol unfold. I looked directly at my son's sweaty, tear-streaked face. For a brief, agonizing second, a vivid memory flashed behind my eyes. I remembered sitting on the edge of a worn porcelain bathtub, carefully bandaging his badly scraped knee when he was just 7 years old, wiping away his tears and promising him the pain would eventually fade. The incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained paternal instinct to step forward to physically shield him from harm and to heal his bleeding wounds surged violently in my chest. I felt the overwhelming urge to write a massive check and magically erase the terrifying federal agent standing before us. I forcefully shoved the instinct down, locking it away behind an impenetrable wall of hard-earned discipline. I understood with absolute tragic clarity that some severe wounds cannot simply be bandaged. Some profound infections must be entirely amputated to save the rest of the body from complete destruction. Jordan slowly turned his desperate, red-rimmed eyes directly toward me. He entirely ignored the federal agent mechanically listing his constitutional rights. He focused the absolute entirety of his fractured attention on my stoic face. His voice cracked with raw, unadulterated terror as he began to beg. He pleaded with me to immediately contact my corporate attorneys and arrange his bail. He frantically begged for one last absolute financial rescue, desperately trying to leverage decades of shared history to buy his way out of federal custody. Jordan's voice completely shattered, breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed miserably against the rusted metal of the commercial storage units. He frantically spewed a desperate, rapid-fire sequence of massive, utterly hollow promises. He aggressively swore he would completely change his entire personality. He loudly promised to immediately file for divorce from Heather, explicitly blaming her for his severe financial crimes and moral failings. He frantically offered to work incredibly long hours in any of my corporate divisions, promising to accept the lowest possible position just to prove his renewed loyalty. He threw out empty, panicked vows born entirely of pure immediate terror, completely devoid of any genuine remorse or actual understanding of the massive damage he had caused. He was simply deploying the very last manipulative tactic he possessed, desperately trying to trigger my paternal mercy to escape the immediate, terrifying reality of a federal prison cell. I remained perfectly still on the cracked asphalt, leaning slightly on my polished wooden cane. I did not shift my weight or attempt to interrupt his frantic, pathetic monologue. I looked steadily at the boy I had raised with absolute devotion and grueling sacrifice. I saw the weak, treacherous man he had willingly and deliberately chosen to become. I saw a man who had easily traded genuine, unconditional love for a shallow, toxic illusion of suburban superiority. I did not nod, and I did not shake my head. I simply maintained absolute, chilling silence, offering absolutely nothing to the man, desperately begging for his life. The two federal agents completely ignored the emotional breakdown. They stepped firmly to Jordan's sides, gripping his shoulders with practiced, unyielding force. They physically turned him away from me and pulled him swiftly toward the heavy armored back door of the black government SUV. Jordan actively resisted the forward momentum, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly against the dirty gravel. He violently twisted his head back over his shoulder, his eyes wide and completely feral. He screamed my name into the humid air, his voice tearing at his throat. He desperately begged me to simply say something, to offer a single word of comfort, or to verbally intervene before the agents forced him into the dark, secure interior of the heavy federal vehicle. Jordan's desperate begging echoed harshly against the rusted corrugated metal of the industrial storage units. His voice cracked with a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he frantically offered me absolutely empty, completely hollow promises of total reform, immediate divorce from Heather, and lifelong servitude within my corporate divisions. The two federal agents completely ignored his emotional collapse. The heavy metallic click of the solid steel handcuffs engaging sharply sliced through the thick, humid air, instantly terminating Jordan's frantic monologue. The distinct, terrifying sound of the locking mechanism echoed distinctly across the cracked concrete parking lot, cutting cleanly through Heather's ongoing theatrical sobbing by the idling taxi. The agents moved with practiced, unyielding efficiency, securing Jordan's wrists tightly behind his back and thoroughly checking the tension of the heavy steel chains. Gregory stood perfectly still beside the open door of the dirty van, staring at his handcuffed son-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The aristocratic patriarch did not reach into his tailored jacket to retrieve his sleek smartphone. He did not bark frantic orders to his powerful corporate litigators. He did not attempt to post bail or offer a single syllable of legal assistance. Gregory possessed a vicious, highly developed instinct for absolute social survival. He instantly calculated the catastrophic permanent collateral damage of Jordan's massive federal offenses. He realized that any public or private association with a man formally charged with severe wire fraud and document forgery would instantly and permanently vaporize his own carefully cultivated, pristine reputation within their exclusive, wealthy circles. He recognized the absolute toxicity of the situation and immediately executed a ruthless, permanent amputation. Gregory grabbed Heather roughly by the upper arm, his grip visibly tight and completely unyielding. He violently yanked his stunned daughter entirely away from her handcuffed husband, dragging her aggressively toward the open door of the idling taxi van. She stumbled over the rough asphalt, completely failing to resist her father's sudden, brutal authority. Gregory shoved her into the cramped back seat alongside the heavy designer luggage and slammed the sliding door shut with a deafening crash. He rounded the rear of the van, pulled open the passenger door, and barked a single furious order at the bewildered driver. He explicitly demanded the man drive them directly to the international airport immediately. They completely abandoned the ruined suburban dream and the arrested husband without casting a single backward glance. Jordan stood trembling uncontrollably on the cracked asphalt. His shoulders slumped as he watched the dented taxi van violently accelerate away from the storage facility. The vehicle kicked up a thick cloud of toxic gray dust, quickly vanishing into the heavy afternoon traffic of the industrial zone. He was entirely alone, physically restrained, and completely abandoned by the superficial family he had sacrificed his own soul to impress. The lead federal agent did not offer a moment of sympathy or pause for the dramatic exit. He positioned himself directly in front of Jordan and began to read the mandatory Miranda warning. His voice was completely monotonous, highly practiced, and entirely devoid of human emotion. The agent stated that Jordan had the absolute right to remain silent, the heavy words hanging in the thick, diesel-choked air. I stood perfectly still next to Mr. Gallagher, silently watching the severe legal protocol unfold. I looked directly at my son's sweaty, tear-streaked face. For a brief, agonizing second, a vivid memory flashed behind my eyes. I remembered sitting on the edge of a worn porcelain bathtub, carefully bandaging his badly scraped knee when he was just 7 years old, wiping away his tears and promising him the pain would eventually fade. The incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained paternal instinct to step forward to physically shield him from harm and to heal his bleeding wounds surged violently in my chest. I felt the overwhelming urge to write a massive check and magically erase the terrifying federal agent standing before us. I forcefully shoved the instinct down, locking it away behind an impenetrable wall of hard-earned discipline. I understood with absolute tragic clarity that some severe wounds cannot simply be bandaged. Some profound infections must be entirely amputated to save the rest of the body from complete destruction. Jordan slowly turned his desperate red-rimmed eyes directly toward me. He entirely ignored the federal agent mechanically listing his constitutional rights. He focused the absolute entirety of his fractured attention on my stoic face. His voice cracked with raw, unadulterated terror as he began to beg. He pleaded with me to immediately contact my corporate attorneys and arrange his bail. He frantically begged for one last absolute financial rescue, desperately trying to leverage decades of shared history to buy his way out of federal custody. Jordan's voice completely shattered, breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed miserably against the rusted metal of the commercial storage units. He frantically spewed a desperate rapid-fire sequence of massive, utterly hollow promises. He aggressively swore he would completely change his entire personality. He loudly promised to immediately file for divorce from Heather, explicitly blaming her for his severe financial crimes and moral failings. He frantically offered to work incredibly long hours in any of my corporate divisions, promising to accept the lowest possible position just to prove his renewed loyalty. He threw out empty, panicked vows born entirely of pure, immediate terror, completely devoid of any genuine remorse or actual understanding of the massive damage he had caused. He was simply deploying the very last manipulative tactic he possessed, desperately trying to trigger my paternal mercy to escape the immediate, terrifying reality of a federal prison cell. I remained perfectly still on the cracked asphalt, leaning slightly on my polished wooden cane. I did not shift my weight or attempt to interrupt his frantic, pathetic monologue. I looked steadily at the boy I had raised with absolute devotion and grueling sacrifice. I saw the weak, treacherous man he had willingly and deliberately chosen to become. I saw a man who had easily traded genuine, unconditional love for a shallow, toxic illusion of suburban superiority. I did not nod, and I did not shake my head. I simply maintained absolute chilling silence, offering absolutely nothing to the man desperately begging for his life. The two federal agents completely ignored the emotional breakdown. They stepped firmly to Jordan's sides, gripping his shoulders with practiced, unyielding force. They physically turned him away from me and pulled him swiftly toward the heavy armored back door of the black government SUV. Jordan actively resisted the forward momentum, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly against the dirty gravel. He violently twisted his head back over his shoulder, his eyes wide and completely feral. He screamed my name into the humid air, his voice tearing at his throat. He desperately begged me to simply say something, to offer a single word of comfort, or to verbally intervene before the agents forced him into the dark, secure interior of the heavy federal vehicle. The profound narrative of Jordan's downfall and his father's ultimate reclamation of dignity serves as a powerful, uncompromising lesson on the absolute necessity of enforcing personal boundaries. In a society that frequently romanticizes the concept of unconditional familial loyalty, this story brutally dissects the toxic nature of enabling destructive behavior under the guise of parental love. The central theme revolves around the realization that love without accountability is not love at all. It is simply complicity. Jordan represents the terrifying extreme of superficial ambition. He actively chose to prioritize a fragile, fabricated social status over fundamental human decency and authentic relationships. He viewed his father not as a human being worthy of respect, but as a deeply embarrassing secret to be buried and later as a disposable financial resource to be exploited. Jordan's tragic flaw was his absolute conviction that he could continuously manipulate the people who loved him without ever facing a tangible consequence. He believed his sophisticated vocabulary and tailored suits insulated him from the reality of his own severe moral decay. Conversely, the father embodies the agonizing but necessary process of emotional amputation. For years, he silently absorbed his son's blatant disrespect and financial parasitism. He adhered to the traditional belief that a parent must endlessly endure pain to protect their child. However, the turning point occurs when he finally internalizes his late wife's wisdom. One must not drown trying to save a person who actively refuses to swim. The father's elaborate counterstrike is not an act of malicious revenge, but an act of profound, radical self-preservation. By allowing Jordan to experience the full catastrophic weight of his federal crimes, the father effectively severs the parasitic bond that was slowly destroying his own legacy. This story teaches us that we cannot negotiate with individuals who fundamentally disrespect our existence. When individuals consistently demonstrate that they value our resources far more than our well-being, we must possess the courage to walk away. True dignity requires us to recognize when a relationship has become irreversibly toxic, even if that relationship is secured by blood. The father's ultimate victory is not found in the destruction of his son, but in the restoration of his own absolute peace. He reclaims his life by firmly refusing to participate in Jordan's destructive illusion. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the hollow nature of performative success. Gregory and Heather built their lives on appearances, completely lacking the resilience to survive reality. When the stolen money evaporated, their entire identity shattered. The ultimate lesson is that authenticity and hard work are the only true foundations of a secure life. We must guard our peace fiercely, cut away those who seek to exploit our kindness, and understand that sometimes the most profound act of love we can perform for a destructive person is to step back and allow them to finally collide with the unyielding wall of their own consequences. Doing so sets everyone truly free. Thus, healing finally becomes absolutely possible, beginning anew today. Never forget this. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in the father's position? Share your perspective and join the conversation.